Consider a moment when someone asks you a casual question while you're thinking about something troubling, and for just a fraction of a second, your face betrays a flash of sadness, anxiety, or disappointment before you catch yourself and replace it with a neutral smile. This phenomenon is what psychologists call microexpression leakage, and it represents one of the most fundamental ways our minds reveal what we're truly experiencing beneath the surface of conscious control. These involuntary facial expressions typically last between 1/12 and 1/5 of a second, far too brief for most people to consciously register, yet long enough to communicate genuine emotion that contradicts whatever words we've chosen to speak. The mechanism behind this psychological occurrence is rooted in the biological architecture of human emotion and the different processing speeds of our conscious and unconscious systems. While our prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for deliberate decision-making and social management, works to construct an appropriate social facade, our limbic system, which governs authentic emotional responses, sends signals to our facial muscles that bypass conscious filtering entirely. The amygdala processes emotional stimuli so rapidly that it triggers facial muscle contractions before our thinking mind even registers that we need to suppress our true feelings. This creates a peculiar lag in our emotional presentation, where the genuine response emerges first and the controlled response arrives only moments later, like watching someone catch themselves mid-fall. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is that despite decades of research demonstrating the unreliability of facial expressions as indicators of truth, and despite our general awareness that microexpressions exist, we continue to interpret them as windows into authentic feeling, and perhaps more remarkably, we continue to be unable to control them in moments of genuine emotional activation. Even individuals trained extensively in emotional suppression techniques find that under sufficient psychological stress or genuine feeling, these microexpressions leak through, suggesting that there exists a threshold beyond which our conscious will simply cannot override the biological imperative of emotional expression. This tension between our desire for emotional privacy and the persistent betrayal of our faces creates an ongoing psychological dynamic in human interaction that remains largely unexamined in our daily consciousness, yet shapes countless micro-moments of social negotiation and mutual understanding. Consider the parent who insists they're not angry at their child, only to have that flash of frustration cross their face and be caught in the mirror of the child's eyes, or the job candidate who claims enthusiasm for a position while a microsecond of doubt flickers across their features. These are the moments where our biology refuses to participate in our deceptions, where the truth finds its way through the cracks in our carefully constructed presentation. Have you ever noticed that peculiar moment when someone asks you a question and then simply stops talking, creating an expansive void where a response is expected, and in that silence, your mind begins to settle into a strange state of cognitive quietness? This phenomenon occurs regularly in conversations, therapy sessions, interviews, and even in our own internal dialogues, where the asker poses their inquiry and then deliberately refrains from filling the space with additional words, allowing the silence to stretch out like a long, patient hand waiting to receive an answer. The silence after a question creates what psychologists refer to as a conversational vacuum, a psychological pressure that demands to be filled, and our brains interpret this emptiness as a cue that something requires our attention and response, which paradoxically exhausts our mental resources as we scramble to formulate thoughts in the face of expectant quiet. When silence follows a question, our minds cannot simply rest. Instead, they become hyperactive, searching through memories and processing language to construct an adequate reply. Yet this very effort to think deeply and formulate coherent responses actually engages the same neural pathways that, when sufficiently taxed, lead to mental fatigue and drowsiness. The questioner's silence is fundamentally a form of social pressure, an unspoken demand that we perform the cognitive labor of thinking. And as our brains work through this demanding task, they gradually deplete their executive function resources in ways that are remarkably similar to the mental exhaustion we experience throughout an entire day. There exists a curious irony in how we have normalized this expectation of silence after questions, as though it is perfectly natural and socially acceptable to place another person in this mentally demanding position. Yet we rarely question why silence should feel so heavy or why the absence of sound should require so much from us cognitively. The persistent nature of silence after questions demonstrates how deeply embedded these conversational patterns are in human interaction, how we continue to employ them even when we understand they create discomfort, and how this very discomfort, when sustained gently and without aggression, becomes almost meditative in its ability to quiet the mind's usual chatter and settle consciousness toward the edge of sleep. In this way, the silence after a question becomes a subtle invitation to surrender, a gentle push toward the vulnerable state where our defenses lower and our consciousness begins to drift, as though the questioner has created the perfect conditions for the mind to finally release its grip and slip toward rest. And perhaps this is why interrogators, therapists, and teachers have long understood the power of strategic silence. Because in that suspended moment when we are forced to fill the void with our own thoughts, we become vulnerable to honesty, to admitting what we truly know, to finally speaking the words that have been waiting in the wings of our consciousness, as our tired minds surrender the effort of resistance and simply offer forth whatever rises to the surface. Imagine a scenario where you have a mild dislike for someone, perhaps a colleague who irritates you or a neighbor with whom you share an awkward distance, and then one day this person asks you for a small favor, something genuinely inconvenient but ultimately harmless, like borrowing a book or help moving a piece of furniture, and after you begrudgingly comply with their request, something curious happens to your perception of them, a subtle shift in how you regard this person emerges. And you find yourself feeling warmer toward them, more sympathetic to their struggles, more inclined to see them in a positive light, even though objectively nothing about them has changed and they have done nothing to earn this newfound affection through their actions or character. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this phenomenon is rooted in what researchers call cognitive dissonance and our innate need to maintain internal consistency in how we view ourselves and our behaviors. When you perform an action on behalf of another person, especially one that requires effort or sacrifice on your part, your mind engages in a peculiar form of rationalization where it seeks to justify why you would exert yourself for someone you do not particularly like. And the most efficient explanation your brain can construct is that you must actually like them more than you thought, that beneath your surface irritation lies genuine care or concern. That your actions must have been motivated by fondness rather than mere obligation or social pressure. This cognitive realignment happens almost entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness, and you simply find yourself genuinely believing that this person is more worthwhile than your previous assessment suggested, that they possess hidden qualities you failed to notice before. The persistence of this effect across centuries and cultures, documented extensively since Benjamin Franklin himself first described the phenomenon in his autobiography, reveals something profound about human nature and how resistant we are to accepting that our behaviors might contradict our true feelings, instead preferring to reconstruct our feelings to match our actions, creating a narrative where everything aligns neatly and our choices make perfect sense. And we continue to operate under this illusion of internal consistency, even as modern psychology has thoroughly documented and explained the mechanism, suggesting that knowing about this trick intellectually does nothing to prevent us from falling prey to it emotionally. This paradox points to a deeper truth. We are not always the architects of our own preferences, and the self we believe ourselves to be is often constructed retroactively to justify the decisions we have already made. A humbling reminder that the boundary between authentic feeling and rationalized emotion is far more permeable than we like to admit. Consider the moment when you're lying in bed, unable to sleep, and your mind begins to wander through the catalog of numbers that might represent how long you've been awake. You glance at the clock and notice it's 11:47 at night, and from that instant, your brain has established what psychologists call an anchor, a fixed reference point from which all subsequent judgments will be made. This first number you consciously register becomes the baseline against which your mind measures time's passage, and it fundamentally shapes how you perceive the duration of your sleeplessness throughout the entire night. When you check the clock again 20 minutes later and see 12:07, your brain doesn't simply register a new time, but rather it compares this new information back to that initial anchor of 11:47, creating a sense of progression and temporal awareness that actually keeps you more alert rather than less. The psychological mechanism at work here is that anchoring effect, wherein the first piece of numerical information we encounter disproportionately influences all our subsequent estimates and judgments, even when we're consciously aware that it shouldn't. Your brain treats that first number as a gravitational center around which all other information orbits, and this creates an ongoing internal dialogue where you're constantly measuring and comparing, constantly aware of the time's passage in a way that prevents the mental drift necessary for sleep. What makes this particularly insidious is that we've normalized the behavior of clock checking despite its obvious counterproductivity. We've integrated it so thoroughly into our bedtime routines that we rarely question whether looking at the time serves any genuine purpose when we're trying to fall asleep. The first number anchors us not just to a moment in time, but to a state of vigilant awareness, and once that anchor is set, our minds resist the dissolution of that numerical reference point, making it extraordinarily difficult to slip into the unconscious state where sleep actually begins. The cruel irony is that the more you resist this anchored awareness, the more you tell yourself to stop thinking about the time, the stronger the anchor becomes, as your very attempts to escape the numerical reference only reinforce its psychological grip, making that first glimpse of 11:47 a ghost that haunts every subsequent moment of your restless night. And so the insomniac learns, too late, that the true cost of that first number isn't merely the time it consumes, but the psychological scaffolding it constructs. A framework of awareness so sturdy that sleep becomes not a natural drift, but a conscious battle against the very measurement system designed to track its absence. In this way, the insomniac's sleeplessness becomes self-perpetuating, not because sleep is physiologically impossible, but because the mind has been trained to remain tethered to that first numerical anchor, transforming what could have been a simple night of rest into an extended exercise in temporal consciousness. Consider the moment you stand before your closet in the morning, mentally exhausted before the day has even begun, facing what feels like an overwhelming number of clothing options, and yet you find yourself selecting from the same narrow rotation of garments that you have worn dozens of times before, and in doing so, you experience a peculiar sense of relief and satisfaction, as though you have made a meaningful decision, when in reality, you have simply followed an invisible script that your brain wrote long ago without your conscious awareness. This phenomenon extends far beyond fashion into nearly every domain of daily life, from the breakfast cereals you choose at the grocery store, where manufacturers display dozens of varieties that are fundamentally identical in nutritional composition, but differentiated only by packaging and marketing language, to the restaurants you select for dinner, where you scroll through endless options on your phone before inevitably returning to the three establishments you have visited repeatedly for months or even years. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior stems from a fundamental quirk of human cognition known as decision fatigue, a state in which the mental resources required to evaluate genuine alternatives become depleted after processing multiple choices. And rather than continuing to expend precious cognitive energy on selecting between truly different options, your brain shortcuts this exhausting process by defaulting to familiar patterns and previously established preferences. What makes this phenomenon particularly insidious is that we have developed an elaborate social and economic infrastructure that actively promotes and celebrates the illusion of unlimited choice, while simultaneously ensuring that most of the options we encounter are functionally interchangeable, creating the satisfying feeling that we are exercising free will and agency when we are in fact navigating a carefully constructed landscape designed to guide us toward predetermined conclusions. We have normalized this state of illusory choice to such a profound degree that the mere appearance of options, regardless of whether those options represent genuine alternatives or superficial variations on an identical theme, has become deeply reassuring to us, and we experience genuine contentment from the act of choosing even when the choice itself is largely meaningless. Which means that the modern world has successfully convinced us that the abundance of pseudo-choices surrounding us constitutes authentic freedom. Yet this comfortable delusion comes at a substantial cost, for in surrendering our attention to the navigation of meaningless options, we remain largely blind to the genuinely consequential choices that actually shape our lives. The ways we spend our time, the relationships we cultivate, the values we allow to be eroded by incremental compromise, choices that demand real courage and clarity rather than the effortless selection of pre-approved alternatives. Consider the subtle dance that occurs when two people sit together in a dimly lit room, perhaps at the end of a long day when both are mentally exhausted and seeking comfort. One person shifts their weight, crossing their legs in a particular way, and within moments, the other person unconsciously adopts an almost identical posture. If the first person leans back into their chair with their head tilted slightly to one side, the second person's body gradually angles itself in the same direction. Their breathing patterns begin to synchronize, their hand movements echo one another, and even the pace at which they blink starts to align. This phenomenon, known as mirroring or postural echo, represents one of the most pervasive yet unnoticed psychological mechanisms that govern human interaction and social bonding. When we mirror another person's body language, our brains release a cascade of neurochemical responses that promote feelings of connection, safety, and relaxation. Mirror neurons, those fascinating cells in our brains that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action, create a neural simulation of what we are witnessing. This creates an unconscious sense of empathy and understanding, making us feel more aligned with the other person. Furthermore, mirroring reduces the psychological distance between individuals by creating a nonverbal language of agreement and attunement. Our nervous systems literally begin to regulate each other through this physical synchronization. As our body language aligns with another person's, our brain interprets this alignment as a signal of safety and trustworthiness, which in turn activates our parasympathetic nervous system, the very system responsible for rest, recovery, and sleep. This is why watching someone else in a relaxed state, or lying beside a calm person whose breathing and posture we unconsciously mirror, can gradually lull us toward drowsiness. Yet despite all the research and understanding we now have about this mechanism, we continue to allow ourselves to be influenced by it without conscious awareness or resistance. And perhaps this passive acceptance of our own vulnerability to such influence is precisely what makes it so effective at easing us into sleep. In bedrooms and on couches across the world, partners drift into sleep beside one another, their bodies becoming instruments of mutual regulation. A silent conversation conducted entirely through the language of synchronized breath and aligned limbs. This reciprocal vulnerability, where we allow another person's physical presence to literally reshape our own physiology, may be sleep's most fundamental requirement, not darkness or silence, but the reassuring knowledge that we are, quite literally, in sync. And perhaps this is why the absence of such synchrony, sleeping alone in a silent room, our bodies moving through their cycles without another presence to entrain them, can feel like a kind of loneliness that no amount of comfortable bedding can truly remedy. The body, it seems, has evolved to sleep most peacefully not in isolation, but in the gentle grammar of another's breath. When you find yourself lying in bed at night, unable to sleep, your mind often drifts toward the conversations and interactions you had throughout the day. And in those moments, many people instinctively begin to mentally reframe difficult exchanges through the lens of understanding the other person's perspective, imagining what pressures they might have been facing, what fears or insecurities might have motivated their words or actions, and this process of deliberately adopting someone else's emotional viewpoint. Even when they frustrated or upset you, creates a psychological shift that is remarkably effective at calming your nervous system. This phenomenon, sometimes called tactical empathy, works because our brains are fundamentally social organs that find comfort in understanding and connection, even when that connection is one-directional and exists only in our own minds. And when we consciously choose to see someone who upset us as a flawed human being dealing with their own struggles rather than as a deliberate antagonist, we deactivate the defensive, vigilant state that kept us emotionally activated during the conflict itself. The mechanism operates through several interconnected pathways. First, mentally adopting another person's perspective requires us to shift out of self-focused rumination and into a broader contextual awareness, which naturally redirects our attention away from our own grievances and anxieties. Second, generating compassion for others, even those who wronged us, triggers the release of oxytocin and other neurochemicals associated with bonding and safety, rather than the cortisol and adrenaline of threat detection. And third, this reframing implicitly reassures us that the world contains reasonable people with comprehensible motivations rather than random cruelty, which is profoundly soothing to the anxious mind. Yet what makes tactical empathy particularly interesting from a cultural and psychological standpoint is how we have normalized this coping mechanism, despite the fact that it requires considerable emotional labor and intellectual honesty. We encourage people to forgive and understand others without often acknowledging that this skill must be deliberately practiced, and that it goes against our brain's default tendency to remain vigilant against perceived threats. And we rarely discuss how this form of perspective-taking can become an unconscious way of managing our own anxiety by essentially outsourcing our emotional regulation to the act of understanding others, creating a quiet dependency on empathy as a sleep aid without recognizing it as such. When we become aware of this dynamic, that we're using empathy to soothe ourselves as much as to understand others, we gain the freedom to choose it consciously rather than defaulting to it unconsciously, and we begin to recognize that the most restorative nights of sleep often come not from perfectly resolving the day's conflicts in our minds, but from the moment we stop trying to solve them altogether and simply allow ourselves to see the other person and ourselves with compassionate acceptance of human imperfection. There exists a peculiar moment in the evening when a person lies in bed, their mind spinning through the accumulated weight of the day, and instead of simply remaining silent with their racing thoughts, they begin to articulate what they are experiencing, often in whispers or soft murmurs directed at no one in particular. They might say things like, "I'm feeling anxious about tomorrow's meeting," or "I notice I am still upset about that conversation," or simply, "I am tired and overwhelmed." This act of vocalization transforms what was previously an amorphous, swirling mass of internal sensation into something with shape and definition, something that exists outside the body rather than entirely within it. The person who engages in this practice finds that the moment they name the emotion, its grip loosens ever so slightly, as though the act of giving it language has somehow removed a portion of its power over their consciousness. The mechanism at work here involves the brain's processing architecture and how it handles information that moves from the implicit to the explicit, from the felt to the articulated. When we experience an emotion without naming it, it exists largely in the limbic system and the amygdala, those ancient structures that deal in sensation and survival without much regard for logic or reason. When we vocalize that emotion, we engage the prefrontal cortex, the more evolved part of the brain responsible for language, analysis, and rational perspective. This engagement creates a kind of cognitive redistribution, where the emotional weight is no longer concentrated entirely in the reactive centers, but is shared with the analytical centers that can observe it with some degree of detachment. Furthermore, the act of hearing oneself speak the emotion aloud creates an external reference point, a moment where the person becomes both the feeler and the observer of the feeling, which introduces a subtle psychological distance that allows for what researchers call effect labeling. Despite having no logical reason for this practice to work beyond the mechanics of how the brain processes information, we have watched it persist across cultures and generations, taught to children by therapists and parents alike, recommended by sleep specialists, and incorporated into countless meditation and mindfulness practices as though it were a fundamental truth about human psychology that everyone simply accepts without question. And yet perhaps this acceptance itself reveals something worth noting, that the simple act of naming what moves within us, anxiety, grief, frustration, hope, contains a kind of wisdom that precedes our understanding of it, a recognition that consciousness itself seems to require witness, and that we become most fully present to our own experience only when we speak it aloud into the listening silence of the night. In this way, the whispered confession becomes a form of testimony, not to anyone else but to oneself, a quiet assertion that what one feels deserves to be heard and held as real. Imagine a scenario where someone asks you for something extraordinarily large, something you would almost certainly refuse, and then moments later, after you decline, they pivot to ask for something significantly smaller and more reasonable. You find yourself far more likely to say yes to this second request than you would have been if they had simply asked for the smaller favor from the beginning. This is the door-in-the-face technique, a subtle psychological manipulation that operates beneath the surface of our conscious awareness every single day. The initial request, which is deliberately unreasonable and designed to be rejected, serves as an anchor point that reframes everything that comes after it. When someone asks if you can lend them $500 and you say no, their follow-up request of $20 suddenly seems manageable and reasonable by comparison. The contrast between the two asks creates a psychological shift in how we evaluate the smaller request, making it appear less burdensome than it actually is. At its core, this manipulation exploits a principle called reciprocal concessions, where our brains are wired to believe that if someone makes a concession toward us, we are obligated to make a concession toward them in return. When the person withdraws their initial outrageous demand and accepts your refusal with grace, it triggers a social norm of fairness within us, making us feel that we should reciprocate by agreeing to something on our part. The person who initially asked for $500 has technically conceded by lowering their request, and this creates an almost irresistible pressure for us to concede as well. What makes this technique so persistent is that it operates in the realm of social obligation and fairness, values that we hold deeply regardless of whether we are consciously aware of being manipulated. We normalize this pattern because it feels like natural negotiation, like a reasonable person adjusting their expectations, and we rarely stop to question whether our sudden willingness to comply stems from genuine agreement or from social pressure carefully engineered by the other party. The door in the face persists because saying no to a second request after refusing the first one can feel rude or ungracious, as though we are punishing someone for having the self-awareness to adjust their ask downward. This technique appears everywhere from sales interactions to interpersonal relationships, always working quietly in the background, shaping our decisions in ways we rarely recognize or acknowledge. Understanding this pattern is the first step toward resisting it, yet even with awareness, the pull of social obligation remains strong enough that we often find ourselves agreeing anyway, trapped between our rational understanding of the manipulation and our deep-seated need to be perceived as fair and cooperative. Perhaps the most insidious aspect is that recognizing the manipulation does not necessarily free us from it. We remain caught between intellectual understanding and emotional compliance, aware of the trick yet still susceptible to its pull. Consider the moment when you tell yourself that you will just lie down for 5 minutes before starting your evening routine, knowing full well that this small commitment will likely lead to something much larger. And as your head touches the pillow and your body begins to settle into the sheets, you find that the initial resistance to sleep has already begun to dissolve through this seemingly insignificant first step. The foot-in-the-door technique, borrowed from persuasion psychology, operates on the principle that once we have made even the smallest commitment or taken the tiniest action toward a goal, we become psychologically more likely to follow through with increasingly larger commitments in that same direction. And when applied to the pursuit of sleep, this principle becomes remarkably potent because the body and mind recognize the signal that we have begun moving toward rest. What happens physiologically is that the moment we decide to lie down, to close our eyes, or to begin a relaxation exercise, our nervous system receives a clear message that the transition toward sleep has commenced, and this message triggers a cascade of neurological responses that make subsequent sleep behaviors feel more natural and inevitable, as if we have already crossed a threshold from which returning to wakefulness would require considerable effort. The psychology underlying this mechanism suggests that commitment, even a voluntary and minor one, activates what psychologists call consistency motivation, a deep human drive to align our actions with our initial decisions and to maintain coherence between what we have said or decided we will do and what we actually do. And in the context of falling asleep, this means that lying down for what we claimed would be 5 minutes creates an internal pressure to actually sleep. To validate that initial commitment, rather than to abandon it and prove ourselves inconsistent. What makes this technique persist so powerfully in our daily lives is that we rarely acknowledge it as a psychological mechanism at all, instead normalizing it as simple common sense, telling ourselves that of course lying down helps us sleep because that is what beds are for, yet we ignore the subtle psychological contract we have created with ourselves through that first small action. And we have become so accustomed to this pattern that we rarely recognize how effectively a single minor commitment reshapes our entire trajectory toward unconsciousness. The same principle extends to every sleep hygiene practice we undertake. Dimming the lights, brewing tea, or even changing into pajamas, each represent small commitments that accumulate into an irresistible momentum toward sleep, until the very act of performing these rituals becomes indistinguishable from the physiological preparation for rest itself. Consider the moment when you find yourself scrolling through your phone before bed and you encounter a video titled, "You won't believe what happened next," or a headline that reads, "This celebrity's secret was finally revealed." Yet the actual content remains hidden behind a clickable link or a paywall that requires your interaction to proceed. Your mind experiences an immediate tension, a cognitive itch that demands resolution, and despite knowing intellectually that the content may be trivial or designed deliberately to manipulate your curiosity, you feel compelled to click, to scroll, to discover what lies beyond that tantalizing threshold. This phenomenon is rooted in what psychologists call the Zeigarnik Effect, named after Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who discovered that our brains retain information about incomplete or interrupted tasks far better than completed ones, creating an almost unbearable psychological pressure to achieve closure. When you encounter an unresolved narrative, unanswered question, or incomplete thought, your brain essentially enters a state of suspension where it continues processing that incomplete information even as you attempt to shift your attention elsewhere, keeping the task alive in your working memory and preventing the natural mental relaxation that typically precedes sleep. This incomplete loop creates what researchers call a cognitive itch, a persistent background activation that makes it extraordinarily difficult to fall asleep because your mind cannot achieve the settledness necessary for the transition into drowsiness. What makes the Zeigarnik Hook particularly insidious in modern life is how deliberately it has been engineered into our digital ecosystem, with content creators, advertisers, and social media platforms weaponizing this natural cognitive tendency by designing headlines, thumbnails, and narrative structures specifically to trigger this unresolved tension. Knowing full well that the drive to achieve closure overrides our capacity for rational decision-making about whether this resolution is genuinely worth our attention. Yet despite possessing complete awareness that these hooks are constructed to manipulate us, despite understanding the mechanism at work and recognizing the attempt to exploit our psychology, we continue to fall into the pattern night after night, each time believing that this particular piece of unresolved information is the one that will be satisfying, that will finally provide the closure we unconsciously crave, and as we lie in bed wrestling with curiosity and frustration. Our parasympathetic nervous system remains activated, our mind remains engaged, and true rest remains perpetually out of reach. The cruelest aspect of this trap is that awareness itself becomes part of the mechanism. Knowing you're being manipulated does nothing to diminish the hook's pull, because the Zeigarnik effect operates beneath the threshold of conscious resistance, a biological imperative that no amount of rational understanding can override, leaving you caught in the exhausting paradox of simultaneously recognizing and succumbing to the very manipulation you're attempting to resist. Consider the moment when you're lying in bed at the end of a long day and your mind begins to rehearse all the things you didn't accomplish, all the opportunities that slipped away, all the conversations you should have had differently, and all the mistakes that seem to echo louder as the house grows quieter around you. This is loss aversion framing at work, a deeply embedded psychological pattern where your brain has become exceptionally skilled at filtering information through the lens of what you've failed to gain rather than what you've actually achieved or retained. When you review your day, your attention naturally gravitates toward the promotion you didn't receive, the fitness goal you didn't meet, the time you wasted scrolling through your phone, or the harsh words you wish you could take back. And this selective focus creates a narrative of deficit that somehow feels more real and more compelling than any of the positive moments scattered throughout those same hours. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon is rooted in our evolutionary survival instincts, where our ancestors' brains were calibrated to notice threats and losses more acutely than gains, because missing a potential danger was far more costly than missing a potential opportunity. And this ancient wiring has remained largely unchanged, even though our environment has transformed dramatically. Our nervous system has learned that losses feel approximately twice as powerful as equivalent gains feel good, which means that losing $50 generates more emotional weight than finding $50 generates, and this asymmetry extends into how we process our daily experiences, causing our minds to weight failures and missed opportunities more heavily than successes. As sleep approaches and your defenses lower, this loss aversion framing intensifies because there are fewer distractions available to compete for your attention, and your mind has more processing power to dedicate to cataloging everything that went wrong or could have gone better, creating a recursive loop of regret and rumination that can persist for hours. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is that it feels entirely rational and justified, as though you're simply being realistic or appropriately self-reflective, when in fact you're operating within a significantly skewed cognitive filter that treats losses and failures as inherently more newsworthy and more important than equivalently sized gains and successes. And this has become so normalized in how we think about ourselves and evaluate our days that we rarely question whether this framework is actually serving us or simply exhausting us into wakefulness. The irony is that this exhausting vigilance was designed to keep us alive in environments where survival margins were razor-thin. Yet in our modern world of relative abundance and safety, the same mechanism now keeps us awake at night replaying social missteps or dwelling on paths not taken. transforming what was once adaptive protection into a source of chronic anxiety that serves no evolutionary purpose whatsoever. When you find yourself lying in bed at night unable to sleep, your mind often presents you with a peculiar set of choices about what you might do instead, and this mental exercise operates through a subtle psychological mechanism known as the decoy effect, where the introduction of an inferior or less appealing option makes your current situation seem relatively more attractive by comparison. You might find yourself thinking about getting up to check your phone, or perhaps scrolling through work emails, or maybe cleaning the bedroom, or reorganizing your nightstand, and as these increasingly unappealing alternatives parade through your consciousness, staying in bed and attempting to sleep suddenly becomes the most reasonable and desirable option available to you. The psychology here operates on a principle that our brains do not evaluate choices in absolute terms, but rather in relative terms, measuring one option against another in a comparative landscape where the mere existence of worse alternatives shifts our perception of what we already have. When you present yourself with the option of lying still in darkness and attempting sleep versus the alternative of bright screens that will further stimulate your already overactive nervous system, your mind begins to recognize the value in the passive option that it might otherwise resist. This mechanism persists remarkably effectively in our modern world despite our intellectual awareness that it functions this way, because the decoy options need not be conscious constructions or realistic scenarios. They operate at a level below deliberate reasoning where your mind automatically generates these comparison points. We have normalized this subtle manipulation of our own decision-making processes to such a degree that we rarely notice when we are employing it. And yet it remains one of the most reliable techniques for achieving psychological acceptance of circumstances we initially resist, demonstrating how our minds can be gently guided toward acceptance through the simple introduction of inferior alternatives. The insomnia sufferer becomes a master of this art without formal training, conjuring increasingly absurd scenarios, reorganizing the garage at midnight, finally responding to that email from 3 months ago, until the original problem of sleeplessness transforms into the most palatable choice available, a victory achieved not through willpower, but through the strategic deployment of worse alternatives that our minds willingly accept as legitimate options. And perhaps this explains why we so rarely achieve genuine solutions to our problems. We become satisfied merely with making them seem preferable to imaginary alternatives rather than actually addressing their root causes. A comfortable self-deception that our minds enthusiastically endorses because it requires nothing more than creative catastrophizing. There exists a peculiar phenomenon that occurs in the moments before sleep, where the mind begins to unconsciously repeat the final words or phrases spoken during the day, creating a subtle loop of familiar sound and meaning that gradually fades into the background of consciousness. This process typically manifests when a person is lying in bed, having completed their evening routine, and finds themselves mentally replaying the last conversation they had, the final sentence from a video they watched, or perhaps the closing words from a book they were reading before deciding to rest. The brain, in this transitional state between wakefulness and sleep, naturally gravitates toward the most recent linguistic input available to it, and rather than fighting this tendency, the mind simply allows these final words to echo softly through thought, repeating them with decreasing intensity and focus until they become almost rhythmic and meditative in nature. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this behavior relates to how the brain processes the most recent and therefore most cognitively available information, which naturally becomes the path of least resistance for mental activity as consciousness begins to lower its defenses and becomes less selective about what it processes. When we repeat these echoing words in our minds, we are essentially creating a form of auditory closure, where familiar linguistic patterns provide a sense of completion and predictability that the anxious or overstimulated mind finds genuinely soothing and comforting. This mechanism ties directly to the principle of cognitive fluency, where our brains prefer to process information that feels easy and familiar, and by simply replaying what we have already heard and processed, we avoid the effort required to generate entirely new thoughts or confront unresolved concerns from the day. What makes this phenomenon particularly persistent despite its apparent lack of logical necessity is that it works remarkably well, and we rarely question why we engage in it. instead simply accepting that our minds naturally drift in this direction as drowsiness approaches, normalizing what is actually a sophisticated psychological trick that our brains have learned to employ without conscious instruction or deliberate choice. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves mentally reciting a friend's parting joke, a partner's goodnight phrase, or even an advertisement jingle. These echoes serve as a gentle anchor to the day we're leaving behind, a final acknowledgement of connection before we surrender to the unconscious mind's own mysterious rhythms and narratives. In this way, the echoing of last words becomes less a quirk of tired cognition and more a ritual of closure, a final conversation with the day itself before we release it entirely. And perhaps there is something profoundly human in this need to end not with silence, but with the gentle reverberation of another's voice still present in our minds, a last whisper of connection that bridges the gap between the world we're leaving and the dreams we're about to enter. Consider the moment when you read a horoscope, a personality assessment, or perhaps a fortune cookie message, and you find yourself nodding quietly, recognizing something deeply true about yourself in those generic words that were written to apply to thousands of people exactly like you. You might read that you are someone who values both independence and deep connections with others, or that you have untapped potential waiting to be discovered, or that sometimes you feel misunderstood even though people generally appreciate your qualities. And each statement seems to unlock something personal within you, something that feels uniquely yours despite the fact that these exact sentiments have been conveyed to millions of other readers throughout history. This phenomenon is called the Barnum Effect, named after the circus promoter P.T. Barnum, who famously understood that there is something in every show for everybody, and it operates through a deceptively simple psychological mechanism rooted in how we process information about ourselves and how we assign meaning to vague statements through the lens of our own experiences. When presented with a sufficiently general statement that contains universal human characteristics or contradictions, our minds engage in what is known as personal validation, actively searching through our memories and self-perceptions to find evidence that confirms the statement applies to us specifically, essentially doing the interpretive work ourselves while believing the statement itself provided that insight. The Barnum effect persists not because we are gullible or intellectually lazy, but because it touches something fundamental about how human consciousness operates, how we naturally seek patterns and meaning in the world around us, and how we are remarkably skilled at finding confirmation for ideas that resonate with us emotionally. We have constructed entire industries around this phenomenon, from astrology to personality typing systems to motivational speaking, yet we rarely examine why these generic statements hold such power over us, why we trust them enough to base decisions on them, or why we feel almost a sense of relief when we read something that seems to understand us without ever knowing us at all. Perhaps what we are truly seeking in these moments is not accuracy but permission, permission to believe that our complexity has been noticed, that our contradictions are not flaws but features of a universally human experience, and that someone, somewhere, understands the particular loneliness of feeling simultaneously ordinary and unique. And in seeking that understanding, we grant these statements a kind of power they do not inherently possess, transforming them from mere words into mirrors that reflect back whatever we need to see in ourselves at that particular moment, making the Barnum effect less a trick of language and more a collaborative act between the statement and the self that receives it. In this way, the Barnum statement becomes a kind of psychological contract, where we agree to find meaning in exchange for the comfort of feeling seen, a transaction so subtle that we rarely recognize we are the primary architects of our own validation. There exists a peculiar human tendency to accept explanations more readily when they are prefaced with the word because, regardless of whether the reasoning that follows actually justifies the request or provides any legitimate foundation for compliance. Consider a common scenario where someone cuts in line at a coffee shop or asks to borrow something from a colleague, and they preface their request with a simple because statement, even if what follows is entirely circular or offers no real reason at all. The person being asked often acquiesces almost automatically, their resistance dissolving the moment that single word appears in the sentence structure. This phenomenon was extensively documented in psychological research, where individuals were far more likely to agree to requests when they included the word because followed by any explanation, even explanations that were tautological or failed to provide actual reasoning. The mechanism at work here involves our deep neurological conditioning to expect that when someone provides a justification, particularly one introduced by because, there must be some legitimate reason being offered, and our brains appear to process the structure of the sentence rather than rigorously evaluating the actual content of the justification itself. We have evolved to trust the framework of logical discourse more than we scrutinize the substance within that framework, which makes sense in a social context where most people are generally offering genuine reasons most of the time. Over time, this psychological shortcut has become so embedded in our social interactions that we barely notice it operating, and requests framed with because have become almost universally more persuasive than identical requests without this linguistic marker. What makes this particularly subtle is that even when we intellectually understand this mechanism, we remain susceptible to it, suggesting that the because justification operates at a level of processing that exists somewhat beneath conscious evaluation, making it one of the most persistent and normalized psychological patterns in daily human interaction. The because justification thus becomes a kind of social lubricant that requires minimal effort to deploy but generates disproportionate compliance, making it an almost irresistible tool for anyone seeking to navigate the intricate negotiations that characterize human relationships, from the trivial to the consequential. Yet perhaps the deeper insight lies in recognizing that this linguistic vulnerability reveals something fundamental about human nature. We are fundamentally cooperative creatures who have evolved to assume good faith in our social exchanges, and the because justification exploits this essential trust by providing the performative gesture of reasoning rather than reasoning itself. When you lie in bed at night unable to sleep, your mind often begins to spiral through a familiar pattern of worry and rumination, cycling endlessly through concerns about tomorrow's obligations, past conversations you wish had gone differently, or vague anxieties that have no particular origin at all. However, there exists a subtle psychological technique that many people employ, often without conscious awareness of doing so, which involves asking themselves very specific types of questions that are carefully calibrated to redirect their attention away from these anxious thought patterns. Rather than asking themselves broad, open-ended questions like, "Why can't I sleep?" or "What's wrong with me?" Individuals who successfully use this technique begin asking themselves narrowly focused, almost impossibly specific questions that require their analytical mind to engage in a very particular way. For instance, someone might ask themselves, "What is the exact texture of the pillowcase against my skin right now?" Or, "If I had to count every breath I've taken today, what number would I be closest to?" Or, "What is the precise color of the darkness I see when I close my eyes?" These questions are calibrated in a way that forces the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logical analysis and problem solving, to focus on concrete, sensory, or absurdly specific information rather than on the abstract threats and worries that typically keep us awake. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally one of cognitive displacement. By asking questions that demand a particular type of analytical attention, the mind becomes occupied with an ultimately neutral task, which naturally crowds out the anxiety-producing narratives that were previously dominating consciousness. The psychological principle underlying this technique relates to what researchers call cognitive load theory, which suggests that our attention is a finite resource, and when we fill that resource with one type of mental activity, we have less capacity for another. Yet despite understanding this mechanism at a rational level, we continue to struggle with insomnia and racing thoughts, suggesting that the barrier to using this technique effectively is not knowledge, but rather our tendency to forget that such tools exist in moments when we need them most. The real mastery of this technique, then, lies not in understanding its mechanics, but in the deliberate practice of embedding these calibrated questions into your pre-sleep routine, transforming them from an afterthought into an automatic response. Much like how a musician doesn't consciously think about finger placement during performance, but rather has internalized it through repetition until it becomes as natural as breathing itself. This is why the most effective practitioners often create a personal catalog of their own calibrated questions, ones tailored to their specific sensory preferences and cognitive patterns, and mentally rehearse them during calm daytime moments, so that when insomnia strikes, retrieving these tools requires no effort at all, only the muscle memory of intention. Consider a moment when someone holds a door open for you, a gesture so minor it barely registers in conscious thought, yet it creates an invisible thread of obligation that pulls through your entire being. The person who performed this small act has, without speaking a word, initiated what psychologists call the reciprocity principle, a deeply embedded social mechanism that compels us to repay kindness with kindness, favor with favor, regardless of whether we consciously agreed to participate in this exchange. This psychological phenomenon operates so subtly that we rarely notice ourselves being guided by it, yet it shapes countless daily interactions and decisions. When someone offers to help us move a piece of furniture, buys us a coffee, or gives us a sincere compliment, they have inadvertently placed us in what feels like a minor debt, and our brains immediately begin calculating how we might restore balance to the social equation. The mechanism underlying this behavior runs deep into our evolutionary history, where cooperation and the ability to track reciprocal relationships meant the difference between survival and isolation within group structures. Our ancestors who failed to reciprocate kindness found themselves excluded from future cooperative endeavors, and this survival-based wiring remains embedded in our modern psychology even when the stakes are far less dire. We feel compelled to return what has been given because, at some fundamental level, we understand that social bonds depend on this delicate balance of give and take. What makes this principle particularly subtle is that it operates regardless of whether we wanted the initial favor in the first place, and it persists even when we recognize it consciously and tell ourselves we should not feel obligated. Someone might slip a small gift into our hands, and despite our protests that it was unnecessary, we find ourselves mentally committed to reciprocation, unable to simply dismiss the gesture without experiencing a vague sense of social discomfort or guilt. This lingering obligation can remain with us for weeks or months, influencing our behavior toward that person even when we have consciously decided we do not owe them anything at all. The insidiousness of this mechanism becomes apparent when we recognize that skilled manipulators and salespeople have weaponized this principle, strategically offering small gifts or favors not from genuine kindness, but as calculated investments in future compliance, knowing that the reciprocity principle will eventually extract a far greater return on their initial modest expenditure. In this way, the very mechanism that evolved to strengthen genuine human bonds has become a tool through which our own nature can be turned against us. A salesman offers you a free sample at the market, and suddenly you feel hesitant to walk away empty-handed. A colleague compliments your work, and you find yourself more willing to help with their project despite your own mounting deadlines. Have you ever noticed that the direction your feet are pointing when you lie down seems to matter far more than it logically should, and that you find yourself adjusting them repeatedly until they align with an invisible preference that you cannot quite name or explain? There exists a peculiar phenomenon where people become almost obsessively concerned with the orientation of their feet relative to the rest of their body and the bedroom itself, spending considerable time rotating their lower legs and ankles until achieving a position that feels not necessarily more comfortable in a physical sense, but somehow more correct in a way that defies rational measurement. The mechanism underlying this behavior appears to stem from our deep evolutionary need for spatial awareness and orientation, a holdover from times when knowing which direction we faced determined our survival and our ability to detect approaching threats, so that even now, when we are safe in our beds and closing our eyes for sleep, our nervous systems remain attuned to directional information as though we were still vulnerable creatures in an open landscape. When our feet point toward a doorway or window, some ancient part of our brain seems to register this as a position of readiness, a way of maintaining an exit route even in unconsciousness. And conversely, when our feet point toward a wall or corner, there is a subtle sense of containment and protection that allows our alert systems to relax just slightly. What makes this particularly fascinating is how thoroughly normalized this behavior has become despite its complete lack of logical necessity in the modern bedroom, where locks exist on doors and windows, where danger does not typically announce itself through physical proximity, and where our feet pointing in any direction whatsoever will not meaningfully alter our safety or our ability to escape should something actually require escape. Yet we continue to adjust, continue to angle ourselves, continue to seek that perfect alignment as though responding to signals that we consciously dismiss as irrational, all while our bodies settle gradually into the breathing patterns and muscle relaxation that precede sleep, making the foot direction tell one of the most persistent and invisible of all our bedtime rituals. Some people report that they cannot fall asleep at all if their feet point toward the bed's foot rather than toward a window or door, as though their subconscious has established a non-negotiable rule about directionality that supersedes all other comfort considerations, while others find themselves waking in the night, only to discover they have unconsciously rotated themselves to face a different direction entirely. Their sleeping bodies, apparently continuing the negotiation long after their conscious minds have surrendered to sleep. Consider the moment when you scroll through your phone late at night and notice a notification that reads, "Only 3 items left in stock," or "This deal expires in 2 hours." And suddenly your mind becomes alert, your pupils dilate slightly, and you feel a subtle urgency creeping through your body even though you weren't particularly interested in the product moments before. This is scarcity signaling in action, a psychological phenomenon that operates beneath your conscious awareness, triggering ancient survival mechanisms that were once essential for our ancestors who genuinely faced resource limitations. When our brains detect that something is becoming unavailable or that access to it might be lost forever, our amygdala activates in a specific way that creates a sense of pressure and importance, flooding our system with just enough cortisol and adrenaline to make us feel that we must act immediately or miss an opportunity that may never come again. The mechanism underlying this response is deeply rooted in evolutionary biology because throughout human history, scarcity of food, shelter, and safety was a genuine threat to survival, and those individuals whose brains responded urgently to signals of limited resources were more likely to secure what they needed and pass on their genes to future generations. Our modern world has weaponized this ancient survival instinct in ways that our psychological systems were never designed to handle, as marketers and digital platforms deliberately engineer scarcity signals into their products and services, manufacturing artificial urgency around items that are produced in unlimited quantities and that will be available again tomorrow or next week or next month. Yet despite our intellectual understanding that most scarcity signals are manufactured illusions designed to manipulate our behavior and extract our money and attention, we continue to fall prey to them with remarkable consistency, finding ourselves unable to resist the pull of limited time offers and exclusive access, and while supplies last, messaging that floods our screens and inboxes daily. This persistent vulnerability reveals something profound about the human mind, that our rational, conscious understanding of a manipulation technique offers almost no protection against it when it activates our deeper emotional and survival-oriented neural systems. And this disconnect between what we know and how we behave remains one of the most humbling aspects of human psychology. The most insidious aspect of this vulnerability is that it doesn't diminish with awareness or education. A neuroscientist who understands the precise neurochemistry of scarcity-driven decision-making is just as likely to abandon their shopping cart when the final hour's timer appears as anyone else, because knowing the mechanism and being able to override it are two entirely different capacities of the human brain. When you find yourself lying in bed at night, perhaps scrolling through your phone or reading a message that requires a response, there exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon where deliberately postponing your reply creates a subtle but profound sense of control and relaxation. Instead of immediately answering a question or engaging with a demand for your attention, you consciously decide to respond later, tomorrow, or whenever you feel ready. And in that moment of deferment, something shifts within your mental state. This delayed response power operates on the principle that by choosing when you will engage rather than being forced into immediate action, you reclaim agency over your own time and mental bandwidth, which paradoxically becomes soothing as your body recognizes that no urgent action is required right now. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the reduction of what researchers call cognitive load, the mental effort required to process information and generate appropriate responses. Because when you tell yourself that you do not need to think about this particular problem until tomorrow, your brain essentially gives itself permission to stop working on it, to cease the background processing that keeps you alert and engaged. This conscious postponement of responsibility creates a gentle permission structure where your mind can finally settle into a state of less vigilance, knowing that the task has been acknowledged but deferred, which feels remarkably different from ignoring something entirely or from the anxiety of an unresolved demand sitting in your awareness. What makes this psychological trick so normalized and persistent is that we rarely examine why delayed response should feel so calming when logically it merely pushes the problem forward in time. Yet the act of choosing the timing, of asserting that you will deal with something on your own terms rather than on someone else's schedule, provides a deep satisfaction that goes beyond the mere logistics of task management. This delayed response power becomes a form of bedtime ritual that signals to your entire nervous system that you are in control, that you have set boundaries, and that sleep is permissible because nothing requires your immediate attention, making it an extraordinarily subtle but remarkably effective tool for transitioning into restfulness. The beauty of this practice lies in its simplicity. A message left unread until morning, an email marked for later, a phone call you will return when you choose. Each small act of deferment accumulates into a profound reclamation of your evening hours, transforming your bedroom from a space of obligation into a sanctuary where time moves according to your own rhythms rather than the demands of others. And in this reclamation of evening autonomy, you begin to notice that the next morning arrives with a curious gift. The urgent message from last night has often resolved itself, the emotional charge has dissipated, and your response, when you finally craft it, emerges from a place of genuine choice rather than reactive panic, proving that delayed response power is not merely about tonight's sleep, but about tomorrow's clarity. Consider the moment when you meet someone attractive or impressive in a single dimension of their life, and suddenly you find yourself attributing positive qualities to them across every other aspect of their existence without any logical basis for doing so. You notice their physical appearance is striking, and immediately you assume they must be intelligent, kind, trustworthy, and competent in ways completely unrelated to how they look. You encounter a person who speaks eloquently about a particular subject, and you begin to believe they possess wisdom and insight in domains where they have demonstrated no actual expertise whatsoever. This phenomenon, deeply rooted in how our brains process information and form judgments, reveals something fundamental about human perception and decision-making that persists with remarkable consistency across cultures and contexts. The halo effect operates through a cognitive shortcut where our minds, faced with limited information and an overwhelming desire to make sense of the world quickly, allow one positive characteristic to cast a luminous glow over all other attributes of a person or object. When you meet someone successful in their career, your brain automatically assigns them credibility regarding their personal relationships, financial wisdom, and moral character, even though professional success tells you nothing definitive about these other dimensions. This mental efficiency allowed our ancestors to make rapid judgments in survival situations, but it continues to influence our thinking today in ways that often work against our actual interests and understanding. We have normalized this effect so thoroughly that we rarely question why we trust a beautiful news anchor more readily than an equally knowledgeable but less conventionally attractive expert, or why we find ourselves drawn to the advice of a charismatic entrepreneur despite their track record of failures being equally impressive as their successes. The halo effect persists because our brains fundamentally prefer coherence and consistency over accuracy, preferring to maintain a unified positive impression of someone rather than holding the cognitive discomfort of believing someone is exceptional in one area while simultaneously being average or flawed in another. This tendency becomes so ingrained in our daily psychology that we cease to recognize we're even doing it at all. Yet the most insidious aspect of the halo effect is that once we have constructed this luminous image of someone, we selectively filter all subsequent information through that initial impression, dismissing contradictory evidence as exceptions or anomalies rather than allowing it to reshape our overall judgment. We become invested in maintaining the coherence of our first impression, protecting it as though it were a central truth about the world rather than recognizing it as the cognitive artifact it truly is. This protective mechanism explains why scandals often fail to fully diminish the reputation of beloved figures. We have invested so deeply in their halo that we unconsciously reinterpret damaging revelations as aberrations rather than truths that should fundamentally alter our perception of who they are. Consider the subtle moment when you're lying in bed, unable to sleep, and you begin mentally repeating calming words to yourself, words like peaceful, serene, drift, soft, or safe. You might whisper these words aloud or simply let them echo in your mind as you settle deeper into your pillow, and almost imperceptibly, your body begins to respond. Your breathing slows, your shoulders relax, and the racing thoughts that kept you awake start to fade into the background. This phenomenon is called priming, a psychological mechanism in which exposure to certain stimuli influences how we respond to subsequent stimuli, often without our conscious awareness. When you repeat calming words before sleep, you are essentially programming your brain to associate certain concepts with relaxation, creating a kind of mental shortcut that bypasses your logical mind and directly accesses your body's relaxation response. The words you choose carry semantic meaning that triggers corresponding neural pathways. The word peaceful activates regions of your brain associated with tranquility, while harsh or energetic words would activate entirely different networks. Over time, through repetition, these words become increasingly potent triggers, and your nervous system learns to anticipate the state of relaxation that typically follows this verbal ritual. What makes this psychological trick particularly fascinating is that it works even when you intellectually understand that words are merely sounds or symbols with no inherent power to change your physiology, yet they do change it nonetheless. We have normalized this disconnect between knowing something is subjective and experiencing it as deeply real, accepting that the mind's interpretation of words can be just as influential as any external medication or intervention. The practice persists because it genuinely functions, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where expectation and physiological response become intertwined, making it nearly impossible to separate the placebo effect from the genuine neurological priming that occurs. This is why the same word might carry different power for different people. Your personal history with a word, the voice you associate with it, even the memory of a moment when it once comforted you, all become embedded in its neurological signature, making your private vocabulary of calm far more effective than any generic prescription could ever be. So when you find yourself reaching for the word safe on a sleepless night, you're not simply reciting a sound, you're activating an entire constellation of moments when you felt protected, when someone spoke that word with genuine care, when your body learned what safety actually feels like, and you're inviting all of that accumulated meaning to settle over you like a weighted blanket woven from your own memory and neurochemistry. And this is why insomniacs often discover their own unique words, not the ones recommended in self-help books, but deeply personal anchors like grandmother's kitchen or rain on canvas. Because true priming requires that the word be yours alone, saturated with the specific gravity of your own lived experience. When you lie in bed at night scrolling through your phone, you might encounter a video of someone else sleeping peacefully, or you might read countless comments from strangers describing how a particular sleep method or product helped them drift off effortlessly. And without realizing it, your brain begins to interpret these signals as evidence that sleep should come easily to you as well, because if so many other people have experienced this success, then surely you can too. This phenomenon operates on a deeply embedded psychological principle known as social proof, which suggests that we tend to believe something is true or effective primarily because we observe others believing it or claiming to have experienced it themselves. When you watch content showing people in tranquil bedrooms with soft lighting, or when you read testimonials from supposed insomniacs who finally conquered their sleep problems using a particular technique or supplement, your subconscious mind registers these observations as legitimate evidence that the solution works, and this recognition alone can actually facilitate the very relaxation response you are seeking. The mechanism functions through a combination of conformity and herd psychology, where our brains are evolutionarily wired to trust the experiences and behaviors of our peers, because historically, following what the group does increased our chances of survival and acceptance within the community. By observing others succeed at something, we reduce our own perceived risk and anxiety about attempting it, and this reduction in stress creates a genuine physiological shift that makes falling asleep more probable. What makes this particularly fascinating is that social proof often works even when we intellectually understand that these testimonials may not apply to our specific circumstances, or that the people sharing their experiences might have vastly different biological or environmental conditions than our own, yet we continue to find ourselves influenced by these cues regardless. We have normalized the reliance on others' experiences as a form of validation and guidance so thoroughly that we barely pause to consider whether a comment from a complete stranger online should actually influence our expectations about our own sleep quality, and yet it does, consistently and powerfully. This paradox becomes even more pronounced when we consider that the very act of seeking out these testimonials and success stories often signals to our brains that sleep is something we should be able to master, transforming what began as anxiety into a kind of hopeful anticipation that itself becomes conducive to rest. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of social proof in sleep culture is that it creates a feedback loop where our failure to sleep as easily as these testimonials suggest only deepens our conviction that something is wrong with us. rather than prompting us to question whether the social proof itself might be distorted by survivorship bias, selective reporting, or the simple fact that people rarely post about their continued struggles after trying a trending sleep hack. When you lie in bed at night, your mind often begins cataloging all the things that worry you, all the tasks left undone, all the conversations that went poorly, and suddenly your body tenses because you realize you have not yet addressed the presentation due tomorrow, or the email you meant to send, or the conversation you need to have with your partner about finances. And in this moment of mounting anxiety, something curious happens when you simply name the objection aloud or in your mind by saying to yourself that you are anxious about the presentation, that you are worried about money, that you are stressed about the relationship, because the act of naming it transforms it from a diffuse, shapeless dread into something concrete and bounded, something you can mentally compartmentalize and set aside for the evening. Telling yourself that this worry is valid and real, but that you will handle it tomorrow when you have daylight and energy and clarity. And this process of externalization through naming somehow convinces your nervous system that the threat no longer requires constant vigilance, that you have acknowledged it sufficiently and can therefore relax. The mechanism appears to operate through what cognitive scientists understand as the labeling effect, wherein the brain's threat detection systems become less hyperactive when the amorphous sense of danger is transformed into a specifically named and therefore categorized problem, because the unconscious mind seems to understand that named problems are problems that have been noticed and registered, and therefore do not require continuous alarm signaling. Whereas unnamed dread and vague anxiety persist because they remain unresolved and therefore demanding of attention. And when you give a worry a name and a shape and a timeline, your prefrontal cortex engages more actively than your amygdala, shifting you away from pure emotional reactivity towards something closer to logical processing. Yet despite the profound simplicity and effectiveness of this technique, most people never consciously employ it, instead allowing their worries to swirl in their minds throughout the night, unprocessed and unnamed, creating the paradox wherein we possess an accessible tool for managing our own anxiety, but rarely think to use it, as though we have normalized the experience of lying awake wrestling with formless concerns rather than taking 30 seconds to say aloud what troubles us. Perhaps this is because naming feels too simple, too small an act to address something as large as anxiety, or perhaps we have been trained by a culture that valorizes action and productivity to believe that merely speaking a problem aloud accomplishes nothing unless it is followed immediately by solving it, when in fact the naming itself is often the first and most essential step toward any real resolution. What you discover when you finally practice this is that naming the objection does not require you to solve it immediately. It simply requires you to acknowledge that it exists, that it matters, and that you are aware of it, which paradoxically grants your mind permission to rest because the problem has been witnessed and will not be forgotten in the morning light. Think about a time when you experienced something difficult, perhaps a long day filled with frustrations and minor annoyances, yet somehow the day transformed in your memory simply because it ended on a positive note. You might recall the entire experience as fairly pleasant, even though you spent most of it feeling stressed and tired, all because those final moments were genuinely good. This phenomenon is what researchers call peak-end memory, and it fundamentally shapes how we remember and interpret our experiences in ways that have almost nothing to do with the actual duration or content of what we lived through. The peak-end rule suggests that our brains do not average out all the moments we experience when forming a memory. Instead, our minds disproportionately weight two specific moments: the peak, which is the most intense or emotionally charged moment during an experience, whether positive or negative, and the end, which is simply the final moments as the experience concludes. These two temporal points become the anchors upon which our entire recollection hangs, overshadowing hours of moderate experiences that fell somewhere in between. The underlying mechanism appears to be related to how our brains prioritize information for storage and retrieval. Evolution may have favored this approach because paying careful attention to the most intense moments would have helped our ancestors identify threats or opportunities quickly, and remembering how situations resolved would have provided valuable information for future decision-making. However, in our modern lives, this mental shortcut creates a curious distortion where a mediocre movie with an excellent ending becomes a movie we enjoyed, or a painful medical procedure that ends painlessly becomes a memory we bear more easily than the actual experience warranted. We have normalized this quirk so thoroughly that we barely question it, making decisions about whether to repeat experiences based not on how we actually felt during most of them, but on the peak moment and how things wrapped up. This peculiar rewriting of our own narratives happens automatically and without our conscious awareness, subtly influencing which memories we treasure and which we dismiss. Understanding this tendency opens a door to intentional living. We might deliberately shape the endings of our experiences, knowing that a thoughtful conclusion to a difficult conversation or a meaningful final moment of a challenging project can fundamentally alter how we integrate that experience into our life story. In this way, the Peekend rule reveals that memory is not a recording device but an interpretation, one we have more agency over than we typically assume. By recognizing that we are not passive observers of our own narratives but active participants in their construction, we begin to understand that the ending we choose for an experience is, in a sense, the ending we will live with forever, making the final moments not merely a conclusion, but an opportunity for redemption, closure, or meaning-making that retroactively reshapes everything that came before. Imagine lying in bed at night, your mind still circling around the events of the day, unable to settle into the quiet darkness that sleep requires, and then you begin asking yourself a series of seemingly simple questions, each one designed to elicit an affirmative response, each one building upon the previous answer to create a psychological momentum toward a desired conclusion or state of mind. This technique, known as the yes ladder or yes set in persuasion psychology, works by establishing a pattern of agreement that becomes increasingly difficult to break, and when applied to your own internal dialogue as you drift towards sleep, it can serve as a powerful tool for quieting the resistant parts of your mind that want to keep you alert and engaged. You might begin by asking yourself something you absolutely know to be true, such as, "Is my body physically safe right now in this bed?" And the answer comes back as a clear yes, which subtly signals to your nervous system that no immediate threat exists, and then you move to the next question, perhaps, "Have I accomplished the basic tasks I needed to do today?" And again, even if the answer feels incomplete, you find yourself nodding internally, building agreement with yourself, and with each successive question that receives a yes response, your mind becomes incrementally more committed to a state of acceptance and surrender. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon relates to something called cognitive consistency, a deeply embedded human need to maintain logical harmony between our beliefs, statements, and actions, so that once we have said yes multiple times, our minds experience a form of psychological pressure to continue saying yes, to remain consistent with the pattern we have established, and this consistency becomes so compelling that it actually makes it harder to return to resistance. What makes the yes ladder particularly subtle and persistent in our nightly routines is that we rarely recognize we are employing it deliberately, yet the mechanism works regardless of our conscious awareness of its operation, and we have somehow normalized this internal dialogue as simply the natural way our minds settle into sleep, accepting that a sequence of gentle affirmations can genuinely shift our mental state, even though logically. Asking ourselves questions should not fundamentally alter our biochemistry or neural patterns, and yet it does, suggesting that the line between psychological technique and biological reality is far more permeable than we typically acknowledge. The yes ladder thus becomes a quiet rebellion against the mind's tendency toward rumination, a way of redirecting our neurological resources from the exhausting work of problem-solving toward the restorative work of acceptance. And in doing so, it demonstrates that the most powerful persuasion is often the kind we practice on ourselves, in the privacy of our own consciousness, where no external voice need convince us of anything we are not already willing to believe. There exists a deeply ingrained human behavior that occurs almost entirely without conscious awareness, one that manifests itself in the quietest hours of the evening when we find ourselves preparing for sleep, and this behavior involves the gradual and almost imperceptible lowering of our vocal volume as the day transitions into night. When you find yourself in conversation during the late afternoon or evening, you may notice that your voice naturally softens, your words emerging with less force and projection than they would during the bright hours of morning, and this subtle shift in vocal intensity creates an acoustic environment that signals to your entire nervous system that the time for restful surrender is approaching. The mechanism operating beneath this phenomenon is rooted in the biological understanding that lower frequencies and reduced volume are associated with safety, intimacy, and the absence of threat or urgency. And when our auditory environment becomes quieter and our own vocal contributions follow suit, our brain interprets these signals as confirmation that no immediate danger requires our attention or response. This psychological phenomenon works bidirectionally, meaning that not only does a quiet environment encourage us to lower our voice, but the act of lowering our voice itself reinforces the message to our brain that we are entering a state of calm and preparedness for sleep, creating a feedback loop that gradually dampens our alertness and activates our parasympathetic nervous system. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is the way it persists across all cultures and age groups, despite the fact that there is no logical evolutionary reason why vocal volume should directly correspond to sleep readiness. And yet we continue to employ this mechanism as if it were an essential component of the sleep ritual, a normalized and expected part of the transition from wakefulness into rest that we rarely question or examine. The softening of our voice becomes so automatic that we perform it without recognition, moving through our evening routines speaking in measured tones and hushed words, and this collective adherence to quieter speech patterns has become such an established social norm that we instinctively adjust our volume when others in our environment are sleeping or preparing to sleep. Treating this adjustment as a natural courtesy and biological necessity, rather than recognizing it as a psychological conditioning we have all internalized. Yet when we examine this behavior more closely, we discover that lowering our voice extends beyond mere consideration for others. It is simultaneously an act of self-soothing, a way of signaling to ourselves that we are safe enough to relinquish control and surrender to the vulnerability that sleep demands, transforming our vocal softness into a kind of auditory blanket that wraps around our consciousness as we drift toward unconsciousness. In this way, the simple act of speaking softly becomes a bridge between the demands of our waking world and the surrender required by sleep. A subtle declaration that we are willing to step away from projection and assertion into the quieter realms of introspection and rest. When you find yourself lying in bed at night, unable to fall asleep, your mind often gravitates toward observing the subtle geometries of your environment, and one particular pattern emerges with surprising regularity: the gaze triangle. This occurs when you become aware of three distinct points of focus in your visual field, typically forming an imaginary triangle connecting your eyes to an object and then to another point in space, creating what neuroscientists refer to as a compositional anchor for your wandering attention. Your eyes might fixate on the corner where two walls meet, then drift to a window frame, and finally settle on the edge of your pillow. And in tracking these 3 points in succession, your brain begins to establish a rhythmic pattern of visual processing that becomes increasingly predictable, and therefore increasingly monotonous to your conscious awareness. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon relates to how your brain processes spatial relationships and how it responds to patterns it perceives as stable and non-threatening. When your visual cortex recognizes a repeating triangular pathway of focus, it gradually reduces the metabolic demand required to process novel information, essentially signaling to your entire nervous system that there is nothing surprising or dangerous requiring your attention in this space. This shift in processing efficiency creates a subtle but measurable decrease in arousal levels, as your brain realizes that these 3 points of reference are consistent, unchanging, and therefore require less vigilance than actively scanning your environment for novel stimuli. Yet despite the fact that this gaze triangle is entirely arbitrary, the specific points you choose hold no actual significance or meaning beyond what your tired mind assigns to them. We continue to engage in this behavior night after night, treating these imaginary geometric patterns as though they possess some inherent calming property. A phenomenon so normalized within human sleep culture that we rarely question why staring at 3 random points in darkness should produce any neurological effect whatsoever. And yet millions of people worldwide have intuitively adopted this practice without ever knowing its name or understanding its underlying mechanisms. Perhaps this is why the practice persists despite its apparent illogic. In the moment when your exhausted mind releases its grip on meaning-making, the gaze triangle becomes less a tool for understanding your bedroom and more a permission slip to stop trying to understand anything at all, transforming 3 arbitrary points in darkness into the most reliable lullaby your own neurology can produce. And in this surrender of meaning, you discover that sleep itself may not be about achieving darkness or silence, but rather about finding the exact right geometry of surrender, the moment when your mind stops constructing narratives about the 3 points and simply becomes them, dissolving the distinction between observer and observed, until even the triangle fades into the unmarked territory where consciousness releases its final claim on the world. Consider the moment when someone announces their intentions to a group of people, whether it is declaring a New Year's resolution to friends at a dinner table, posting about a fitness goal on social media, or telling colleagues about a project they plan to complete by a specific deadline. The act of making this declaration public creates a subtle but powerful psychological mechanism that fundamentally alters their behavior and decision-making in the weeks and months that follow. When we voice our intentions to others, we are not simply sharing information. We are creating what psychologists call a consistency principle, where our minds become deeply invested in following through on what we have publicly stated, because abandoning that commitment would create cognitive dissonance and threaten our social image. The brain recognizes that backing away from a public declaration carries social costs, including embarrassment, loss of credibility, and the internalized shame of being perceived as unreliable or weak-willed. This recognition triggers a cascade of behavioral reinforcements that make us more likely to actually achieve what we promised, even when the original motivation was weak or fleeting. The mechanism operates through several interconnected layers. First, there is the immediate social accountability that makes us feel watched and evaluated by our peers, which activates our desire to maintain a positive reputation. Second, there is the internal commitment that forms when we hear ourselves speak our goals aloud, almost as if our own voice becomes a witness to our promise. Third, there is the ongoing psychological tension that persists whenever we consider abandoning our stated goal, because doing so would force us to acknowledge the gap between our public persona and our private actions. What makes this psychological trick particularly subtle and persistent is how deeply we have normalized the act of public commitment in modern society, from birthday wishes to graduation speeches to wedding vows to business announcements. We rarely question why a simple spoken promise carries such weight when it changes nothing material about our actual circumstances or capabilities. The commitment exists only in the social sphere, yet it reshapes our internal landscape so thoroughly that we find ourselves lying awake at night, thinking about our promises and how we will honor them, unable to rest until we have mentally reaffirmed our dedication to the stated goal. This is why a casual mention of learning an instrument to a friend can transform into months of practice sessions, or why telling your family you are reading more books this year means you find yourself actually finishing novels you would have abandoned in solitude. The public declaration has converted a private wish into a social contract that our minds treat as binding, even though no formal agreement was ever signed. Have you ever noticed how sitting next to someone who is calm and peaceful can gradually shift your own state of mind, even without any direct conversation taking place between you, and how conversely, being around someone who is anxious or restless can make your body mirror that tension and unease? This phenomenon is emotional contagion, the subtle mechanism by which our nervous systems synchronize with those around us through an unconscious process of emotional mirroring and physiological resonance. When you enter a room where someone has established a deeply relaxed state, their slower breathing patterns, their lowered vocal tone, their stillness, and the overall electromagnetic field they project begins to influence your own body without your conscious awareness, as though their calmness is literally transferring into your own neurology through proximity alone. The mirror neurons in your brain, those remarkable cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that action, are constantly working to align your internal state with the emotional weather of your environment, causing your heart rate to slow when surrounded by serene individuals, or your cortisol levels to rise when positioned near someone radiating stress. This happens because evolution designed us as social creatures whose survival often depended on reading and matching the emotional states of our tribe, and that ancient programming remains fully active in the modern nervous system, regardless of whether we consciously acknowledge it. When you lie in bed and consciously choose to spend your final waking moments near calming content, near recordings of peaceful voices, or by recalling interactions with deeply tranquil individuals, you are essentially borrowing their emotional state through this contagion effect, allowing their cultivated peace to seep into your own consciousness. It persists as one of our most underestimated psychological mechanisms precisely because it operates entirely beneath the threshold of conscious recognition, and we rarely name or acknowledge this invisible exchange of emotional resonance that happens continuously between bodies in proximity to one another. Yet this very invisibility grants it tremendous power. When you consciously recognize that the quality of presence you cultivate becomes the emotional atmosphere others absorb, You understand that your inner work of developing genuine calm is not a solitary achievement, but a gift that ripples outward to everyone within your electromagnetic reach, making your personal peace a form of generosity that requires no words or effort to transmit. This means that the simple act of becoming more peaceful is simultaneously an act of service to everyone around you. Your calm nervous system becomes a tuning fork that helps others find their own frequency of rest. And in this way, the most solitary work of inner cultivation becomes the most relational gift you could possibly offer. When you lie in bed at night, caught between wakefulness and the pull of sleep, there exists a peculiar moment when your mind suddenly becomes aware of its own racing thoughts, and in that awareness, you make a deliberate choice to stop talking to yourself entirely. You cease the internal monologue, you release the grip on whatever worry or excitement occupied your mental space just seconds before, and you create what might be called a void of intention, a pause so complete that it feels almost like stepping outside of your own consciousness temporarily. This is the strategic pause, and it functions as one of the most effective yet underappreciated tools your mind uses to transition towards sleep. The mechanism operates on a deceptively simple principle. The moment you stop actively thinking about sleep, stop consciously trying to achieve it through effort or analysis, your nervous system interprets this cessation of mental labor as a signal that safety has been restored. Your brain, which has been operating under the assumption that something required your focused attention and vigilance, suddenly receives the message that the emergency has passed, that there is nothing urgent demanding your cognitive resources, and therefore the entire infrastructure of alertness can begin to power down. This pause is strategic precisely because it is intentional yet appears effortless, a paradox that our minds have learned to navigate through years of experience with the sleep process. The pause tells your body that you have completed the work of the day, that you have processed what needed processing, and that now you are genuinely finished. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that we have internalized this practice so completely that we rarely acknowledge its occurrence or its necessity, treating it instead as something that simply happens to us rather than something we actively orchestrate, even though the pause itself requires a certain conscious decision to let go, a deliberate abandonment of the need to remain engaged with thought, which paradoxically becomes the most productive thing you can do when your only goal is to sleep. When you finally master this pause, you begin to notice it operating in other areas of your life. The moment before you speak in a difficult conversation, the breath you take before making a decision, the split second when you choose not to defend yourself in an argument, and you realize that sleep was simply the first place your mind learned that sometimes the most powerful action is the deliberate choice to do nothing at all. In this way, the strategic pause becomes not merely a sleep technique, but a foundational skill for navigating consciousness itself. A recognition that the spaces between our thoughts are not empty voids to be feared, but fertile ground where genuine rest, clarity, and renewal take root. This is why those who learn to pause strategically often report not just better sleep, but a quieter mind throughout their waking hours, as if they have finally given their inner monologue permission to step back and let silence do its work. When you find yourself lying in bed at night, you might notice that the language you use in your internal monologue shifts subtly toward what linguists and psychologists call assumptive language, a rhetorical pattern where statements are framed as if certain conclusions have already been established or agreed upon before they are actually presented. Rather than saying, "I will try to fall asleep," your mind begins constructing thoughts along the lines of "I'm already getting drowsy" or "my body is settling into rest." And this linguistic choice creates a peculiar psychological effect that feels nearly invisible in the moment. The mechanism at work here operates on the principle that language does not merely describe reality, but actually shapes how your brain processes and responds to reality, a concept that has deep roots in cognitive psychology and linguistic theory. When you use assumptive language, you are essentially bypassing the critical evaluation stage of your mind, the part that would normally question whether something is true, and instead you are inviting your consciousness to accept a premise as already established so that it can move forward to the next logical step in the sequence. Your brain recognizes this linguistic pattern as a signal that certain foundational facts have been settled, and it begins to align your physiological responses, your breathing patterns, and your mental focus to match the assumption that has been embedded in your language. This is particularly powerful at bedtime because your mind is already in a suggestible state, already loosening its grip on the analytical frameworks that dominate your waking hours, and assumptive language takes advantage of this natural shift in cognitive mode. What makes this phenomenon particularly fascinating is that we have developed almost no conscious resistance to it, despite the fact that assumptive language contains no actual logical force or evidence, and we continue to fall under its influence repeatedly without recognizing the mechanism, treating the assumed conclusions as if they were observations about an external reality rather than constructions of our own language. Even when we understand intellectually how this works, even when we can identify it happening in real time, we find ourselves unable to fully escape its influence because language and thought are so fundamentally intertwined that attempting to use language while simultaneously rejecting its assumptive structure creates a paradoxical tension that our minds naturally resolve by simply accepting the assumption and moving forward towards sleep. This is perhaps why the most effective sleep techniques, from meditation scripts to therapeutic visualizations, rely so heavily on assumptive framing, constructing narratives where rest is not a goal to be pursued, but a state that is already underway, already claiming you, already complete before you have even fully surrendered to it. There exists a peculiar human behavior that occurs when we find ourselves unable to sleep, a moment where we deliberately allow ourselves to acknowledge our own weakness, our own uncertainty, our own fears about the future or the present circumstances surrounding us. Rather than pushing these thoughts away or attempting to distract ourselves with stimulation, we instead lean into them, we sit with them, we permit ourselves to feel the weight of our own fragility as if we are confessing something deeply personal to ourselves in the darkness. This act of intentional vulnerability, of choosing to face rather than flee from our anxieties, paradoxically begins to soften the sharp edges of our restlessness and creates a strange calm that settles over our nervous system like fog rolling across still water. The psychological mechanism at work here operates on a principle that mental resistance requires energy, that the act of suppressing or fighting against our own thoughts and emotions demands constant vigilance and muscular tension, both mental and physical, which keeps us locked in a state of hyperarousal that prevents the body from transitioning into sleep. When we instead adopt a posture of acceptance, when we consciously permit ourselves to be vulnerable and acknowledge the legitimate concerns or insecurities that occupy our minds, we release the energy that was being spent on resistance and denial, and this energy reallocation allows our nervous system to downregulate and settle into a more parasympathetic state. The brain interprets this voluntary vulnerability as a signal of safety, as if we are saying to ourselves that we have decided we are safe enough to let our guard down, that there is nothing so immediately threatening that we must remain in a state of constant defensive vigilance. What makes this behavior particularly interesting is that we have somehow learned to normalize the opposite approach in our waking hours, where vulnerability is often treated as weakness, and where admitting uncertainty or fear is perceived as something to be hidden or overcome through sheer force of will. Yet in the quiet darkness of bedtime, when our defenses are naturally lower and our bodies are already primed for rest, this culturally discouraged vulnerability becomes precisely the tool we need to surrender into sleep. Perhaps this is why the most restful sleepers are often those who have learned to extend this bedtime vulnerability into their daytime lives, who understand that the admission of limitation is not a surrender to weakness, but rather a strategic acknowledgement of reality that paradoxically grants us greater resilience and flexibility than the exhausting pretense of invulnerability ever could. In this way, vulnerability becomes not a liability to be managed, but an asset to be cultivated, a recognition that our willingness to acknowledge what we cannot control or predict actually expands our capacity to respond thoughtfully to life's uncertainties, much as the martial artist's relaxed stance grants them more fluid movement than rigid tension ever could. Consider the moment when you've spent 2 hours watching a television series that you're not particularly enjoying, yet you continue watching anyway because you've already invested so much time into understanding the plot and characters. This is the sunk cost fallacy at work, a subtle psychological nudge that operates quietly beneath the surface of our decision-making processes every single day. The mechanism is deceptively simple. We have already spent money, time, or effort on something in the past, and even though that investment cannot be recovered regardless of what we do now, we feel compelled to continue our commitment to justify what we've already put in. When you've paid $50 for a concert ticket that you're no longer excited about attending, You find yourself going anyway because you cannot bear the thought of that money being completely wasted, never mind that the money is gone regardless of whether you attend or not. This same pattern emerges when you're halfway through reading a book that bores you profoundly, yet you persist to the end because abandoning it feels like admitting defeat against the hours you've already sacrificed. The psychological underpinning here involves our deep human discomfort with loss and waste, coupled with an irrational belief that we can somehow recover past investments by throwing good money or time after bad. We experience a phantom sense of recoupment, as though our continued participation somehow redeems the initial expenditure, when in reality we are simply multiplying our losses. What makes this nudge so persistent is that it operates beneath conscious awareness most of the time, and we have collectively normalized this behavior to such a degree that continuing despite diminishing returns feels like prudent financial or personal management rather than the cognitive distortion that it truly is. The insidious nature of this nudge is that it masquerades as responsibility and commitment, virtues we deeply value, when in truth it represents a fundamental misalignment between our past selves and our present circumstances. By recognizing that sunk costs are irrelevant to present decisions, we liberate ourselves to choose based on what actually serves us now, rather than remaining shackled to choices we can no longer change. The true freedom lies in asking ourselves a single clarifying question before continuing any endeavor. If I hadn't already invested in this, would I choose to do it now? When the honest answer is no, we've identified the moment to break free and redirect our limited resources toward pursuits that genuinely align with our current values and desires. This reorientation transforms how we navigate countless daily decisions, from abandoning half-finished projects to leaving restaurants when the food disappoints us, reminding us that our time and energy are the most precious resources we possess, and they deserve to be spent on what truly matters in this moment, not what we've already lost. There exists a peculiar moment in the human mind that occurs when we encounter something incomplete, something unresolved, something that dangles just beyond our immediate understanding, and in that moment, our entire consciousness becomes oriented toward closure. Imagine lying in bed at night, scrolling through your phone before sleep, when you see a headline that reads, "You won't believe what happened next." Or perhaps you catch the beginning of a story from a friend that trails off into silence, and suddenly your tired mind, which moments before was heavy with the weight of the day, becomes impossibly alert and focused on discovering what comes next. This is the curiosity gap, and it represents one of the most fundamental mechanisms by which our psychological architecture compels us forward into engagement and thought. The gap itself is the space between what we know and what we want to know, between the information we possess and the resolution we seek, and this gap creates a kind of psychological tension that feels almost physically uncomfortable until it is resolved. Our brains are essentially prediction machines, constantly generating expectations about the world and comparing them against reality, and when a significant discrepancy emerges, when something remains uncertain or unexplained, our minds treat this as an error signal that demands correction. We cannot simply accept the incompleteness. We are driven, almost compulsively, to fill in the blanks and restore a sense of coherence to our understanding. What makes the curiosity gap particularly powerful as a sleep aid is that it can be directed inward, toward your own thoughts and memories and questions, rather than outward toward external stimuli, and when you allow your mind to wander toward unresolved questions, unanswered wonderings, or gentle mysteries about your own life, you create a kind of mental narrative that feels engaging enough to hold your attention, but lacks the sharp stimulation of external content. It is a paradoxical tool. You use the gap itself as a means to occupy your mind with something that is inherently soothing because it is incomplete, because it never quite demands resolution before sleep overtakes you. You might, for instance, wonder about a half-remembered conversation from years ago, or gently probe at the edges of a decision you once made, allowing your mind to construct and reconstruct these narratives in a way that feels like thinking without the urgency of actual problem-solving, until the gap itself becomes a comfortable darkness into which you finally drift. In this way, the curiosity gap becomes less a tool of frustration and more an instrument of gentle surrender, where the mind's natural hunger for answers transforms into a kind of meditative wandering that gradually dissolves into sleep itself, leaving the questions suspended in that liminal space between wakefulness and dreams where they belong. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human interaction where the simple act of holding a warm object or experiencing warmth through physical contact subtly influences how we perceive and judge the people around us. And this effect operates so quietly beneath our conscious awareness that most people never recognize it is happening at all. When you hold a warm cup of coffee or tea before meeting someone new, you are far more likely to form positive impressions of that person, to perceive them as more trustworthy, more generous, and more genuinely interested in connecting with you. Whereas if you had held a cold beverage or walked into that same meeting with cold hands from the winter air, your judgments would have tilted noticeably toward skepticism and emotional distance. This phenomenon extends even further into the realm of decision-making, where researchers have demonstrated that people who experience physical warmth are more likely to make generous choices, to offer help to others, and to view situations through an optimistic lens, all because their brain has conflated the sensation of physical warmth with the metaphorical warmth of human connection and kindness. The mechanism behind this association runs deep into our neurological wiring and our earliest experiences as infants, when physical warmth from caregivers became forever linked in our developing minds with safety, nourishment, comfort, and unconditional acceptance, creating a neural pathway so fundamental that it persists into adulthood despite our intellectual understanding that a warm coffee cup has absolutely nothing to do with someone's actual character or trustworthiness. What makes this particularly fascinating from a relaxation perspective is that by consciously warming your hands before sleep, whether through holding a warm drink, running them under warm water, or simply wrapping them in blankets, you are triggering this ancient association with safety and comfort, which then cascades through your nervous system as a signal that the environment is safe enough for deep rest. The irony is that even as adults who understand the science behind this illusion, we remain entirely susceptible to it, and perhaps even more so, because we have normalized this response so thoroughly into our daily rituals that it no longer feels like psychology at all, but rather like simple self-care and the natural order of how humans transition towards sleep. In this way, warming your hands becomes not merely a physical comfort, but a form of psychological permission, a gentle signal to yourself that kindness and safety are not luxuries to be earned through productivity or achievement, but rather your birthright as a mammal designed to seek warmth, and in seeking it, to find the conditions under which genuine rest becomes possible. So the next time you find yourself restless at bedtime, reaching for that warm mug or turning on the shower to heat your hands, you are not indulging in a frivolous habit. You are honoring an ancient contract between your body and your mind, a tacit agreement that warmth means you are held, you are safe, and you are finally allowed to let go. Throughout the course of a typical day, your eyes engage in a rhythmic pattern of opening and closing that occurs somewhere between 12 and 15 times per minute, a frequency so automatic that you rarely notice it happening at all. Yet as the evening approaches and your body begins to wind down from the constant stimulation of work, screens, and social interaction, something subtle shifts in this mechanism that most people never consciously recognize. When you sit in your bed or lie down in a darkened room with the intention of falling asleep, your blink rate naturally begins to decrease in a gradual and almost imperceptible way, moving from that standard 15 blinks per minute down to perhaps 8 or 9, and this deceleration creates a series of cascading neurological effects that your brain interprets as permission to begin the process of entering sleep itself. The mechanism operating beneath this phenomenon is rooted in the relationship between your parasympathetic nervous system, the one responsible for rest and recovery, and the physical act of blinking itself, which serves as both a protective mechanism for your eyes and a subtle indicator to your brain about your level of alertness and engagement with the external world. When your blink rate decreases, the intervals between blinks lengthen, and during these longer periods where your eyelids remain open, your eyes experience a gentle reduction in stimulation and moisture that signals to your nervous system that you are no longer in an alert, defensive state, but rather transitioning into a more relaxed and inward-focused mode of consciousness. This shift in blinking patterns also correlates directly with reduced cognitive load, meaning that as your mind begins to release its grip on the pressing concerns of the day and stops actively processing new information at full capacity, the conscious effort required to maintain normal blinking frequency naturally diminishes, creating a feedback loop where slower blinking leads to deeper relaxation, which in turn reinforces the slower blinking pattern itself. Yet despite this being such a fundamental and reliable aspect of human physiology, most people remain entirely unaware that this shift is occurring, and they certainly do not recognize it as a powerful psychological anchor that their body uses to communicate its readiness for sleep. which suggests that our bodies have developed these elegant systems of self-regulation that operate beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. Persisting silently and consistently across millions of individuals every single night without drawing any attention to themselves whatsoever. If you were to become consciously aware of this mechanism, to sit in the darkness and deliberately monitor your own blink rate as it slows, you would likely find that the very act of observation disrupts the process itself, much like how focusing intently on falling asleep often prevents it from happening, a paradox that reveals how these physiological transitions require a kind of benign neglect to unfold properly. There exists a peculiar moment that occurs frequently in social environments where someone receives praise not directly from the person affected by their actions, but rather through an intermediary who has overheard or witnessed the positive sentiment and chosen to relay it forward. Imagine a scenario where you have prepared a meal for a gathering, and while you attend to other tasks in another room, a guest mentions to your partner how impressed they were with the flavors and presentation, and your partner later conveys this compliment to you in a casual manner during dinner preparation or before bed. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what researchers understand as the amplification effect of indirect praise, wherein compliments that reach us through a third party seem to carry greater weight and authenticity than direct compliments, primarily because we unconsciously perceive them as unfiltered observations rather than polite social rituals. When someone praises us directly, our minds maintain a subtle skepticism, wondering if they are simply being courteous or maintaining social harmony. But when that same praise arrives through an intermediary who is under no obligation to relay the message, our brains register it as genuine testimony, as evidence that the positive impression was significant enough to be worth mentioning separately. This mechanism taps into our deep-seated desire for authentic recognition and our inherent distrust of face-to-face compliments, which we often assume contain elements of social performance. The persistence of this phenomenon reveals something fundamental about human psychology. We have become so attuned to detecting insincerity in direct interactions that we have developed a competing cognitive bias, where we trust the unfiltered thoughts of others more than we trust kind words spoken directly to our faces. We have normalized this counterintuitive preference for indirect validation, accepting it as simply how humans process social information, rarely questioning why we would privilege a second-hand account of someone's feelings over their direct expression of those same feelings. Yet this preference extends beyond mere psychology into the realm of social dynamics. The third-party compliment becomes a form of currency that circulates through our social networks, gaining value precisely because it was never intended for our ears, making us feel seen not through direct performance but through authentic observation. In this way, the third-party compliment paradoxically becomes more valuable precisely because it was never meant as a gift, transforming casual observation into a form of evidence that we have made a genuine impression on the world around us, one that survives the absence of our conscious effort to impress. When you find yourself in a conversation with someone just before bed, you might notice that your speech patterns, gestures, and even your breathing rhythm begin to mirror theirs without any conscious effort or deliberate intention on your part. This phenomenon, known as the Chameleon Effect, is a subtle psychological mechanism where humans naturally synchronize their behaviors, body language, and speech patterns with those around them, creating a sense of rapport and connection that feels almost invisible in the moment. As you sit with a friend or family member who speaks slowly and deliberately, your own pace of speech naturally decelerates, and when you notice them adopting a relaxed posture, your shoulders seem to drop and your body settles into a similar comfortable position without you actively deciding to do so. The chameleon effect operates through mirror neurons in the brain, specialized neural cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action, essentially creating a neurological bridge between ourselves and others that facilitates unconscious mimicry. This automatic behavioral synchronization serves an evolutionary purpose, as it deepens social bonding, increases feelings of affiliation, and reduces interpersonal tension, which is precisely why conversations with people we naturally mirror feel so effortless, and why interactions with people whose behaviors we do not mirror often feel strained or uncomfortable in comparison. As you lie in bed replaying a conversation from earlier, you might realize that the person who made you feel most at ease was someone whose speech rhythm and mannerisms you had unconsciously synchronized with, and this matching of behaviors had created a psychological state where defensiveness dropped and trust increased naturally. What makes the chameleon effect particularly noteworthy is how completely automatic and non-deliberate it remains, persisting even after we become aware of it, suggesting that this drive to synchronize with others is so deeply embedded in our social programming that awareness alone cannot override it. And we continue to mirror those around us regardless of whether we logically understand the mechanism or can intellectually predict when it will occur. Yet this unconscious mirroring also reveals something profound about human nature. We are not isolated individuals but fundamentally social creatures whose nervous systems are designed to attune to one another. And in those moments when you catch yourself adopting someone else's mannerisms or speech patterns, you are witnessing the biological basis of empathy itself, a wordless, automatic declaration that you are present with another person and willing to meet them in their own psychological space. This synchronization extends beyond mere comfort. It becomes a mutual validation, where both parties sense they are being truly understood, and this silent agreement to move together through conversation may be one of the most fundamental ways humans communicate that they value one another's presence. When two people who know each other make eye contact from across a room or street, a peculiar and nearly universal gesture occurs that happens so quickly most of us never consciously register it, yet it carries profound social meaning in that fleeting moment of recognition. The eyebrow flash is a rapid raising and lowering of the eyebrows that typically lasts only a fraction of a second, usually accompanied by a slight smile or nod, and it functions as a nonverbal acknowledgement that says more than words could express in that instant. This gesture appears spontaneously when someone sees a familiar face, someone they have positive associations with, someone they are genuinely pleased to encounter, and the eyebrows elevate upward in a quick movement that opens the eyes slightly wider before returning to their resting position. The psychological mechanism behind this subtle movement operates on several interconnected levels that researchers have studied across diverse cultures and social contexts around the world. When we recognize someone we know and like, our brain triggers a cascade of neurological responses that prepare us for social interaction, and the eyebrow flash is one of the involuntary physical manifestations of this internal recognition and positive emotional state. The elevated eyebrows also make our face appear more open and approachable, unconsciously communicating that we are receptive to interaction and that we pose no threat, which helps establish immediate rapport and signals friendliness within that split second of contact. Despite being so quick that it often escapes conscious awareness, the eyebrow flash has been documented across numerous cultures including Japan, Brazil, Polynesia, and many others, suggesting it may have deep evolutionary roots in human social bonding and recognition systems. Yet in contemporary life, we rarely discuss this greeting or explain why it happens, treating it as something so natural and automatic that it requires no explanation or conscious thought, even though it represents a remarkable coordination of facial muscles and emotional processing occurring at lightning speed. We have simply normalized this microexpression so completely that most people go through their entire lives never knowing they perform this gesture regularly, or that others are unconsciously reading it as a sign of recognition and positive regard. Yet if we were to pause and observe this gesture intentionally the next time we encounter a friend across a crowded room, we might develop a newfound appreciation for how our bodies communicate what our minds feel before our mouths have time to speak, recognizing that even the smallest movements carry the weight of human connection. In this way, the eyebrow flash becomes a window into the authenticity of human connection, revealing genuine pleasure that cannot be faked or forced, since the gesture emerges from the involuntary nervous system rather than conscious control, making it one of the few honest tells we possess in our social interactions. When two people need to have a conversation in a confined space, or when they're waiting together for something to happen, there exists an almost universal tendency to position themselves side by side rather than facing one another directly. This spatial arrangement reveals itself in countless everyday scenarios. Two people waiting for an elevator naturally gravitate toward standing parallel to each other rather than face to face. Friends walking together down a hallway arrange themselves shoulder to shoulder, Colleagues having a casual conversation at an office kitchen counter instinctively turn their bodies sideways rather than squaring their shoulders directly ahead. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior operates on multiple levels simultaneously. When two people stand directly across from each other, their brains interpret the positioning as confrontational or demanding of intense social engagement, creating an invisible pressure to maintain consistent eye contact and give undivided attention, which triggers a mild anxiety response even in perfectly friendly contexts. Conversely, standing beside another person engages what neuroscientists call parallel processing, where the shared external focus reduces the intensity of interpersonal demand and allows conversations to flow with less self-consciousness. This lateral positioning also provides an escape route, both literally and psychologically, as neither person feels trapped or cornered by the other's presence. The behavior has become so deeply normalized in human social interaction that we rarely notice ourselves doing it, yet it persists across cultures and age groups with striking consistency. We've accepted this unspoken rule so completely that deviating from it, standing face to face when merely waiting or having a casual chat, feels oddly inappropriate or overly formal, even though there exists no logical reason why two humans couldn't stand directly across from each other. This psychological trick works so effectively because it operates entirely beneath conscious awareness, allowing our nervous systems to regulate social comfort without our minds ever registering that regulation is occurring at all. The next time you find yourself in conversation with someone, notice how quickly you both shift your bodies into alignment. It happens within seconds, an automatic recalibration toward comfort that neither of you consciously decided upon, yet both of you immediately understood. This silent choreography becomes even more apparent when it breaks down. Notice the discomfort that surfaces when someone deliberately faces you head-on during a mundane interaction, or how quickly a conversation shifts from casual to confrontational the moment two people square their shoulders directly toward one another, revealing just how much of our social ease depends on this simple spatial compromise between connection and autonomy. We've essentially engineered a way to be together while remaining partly apart, to connect without the full vulnerability that face-to-face positioning demands, and it is perhaps this very compromise that makes modern social life, crowded, demanding, and often exhausting, bearable at all. When two people engage in conversation, a subtle but powerful dynamic emerges where one person's vulnerability seems to naturally invite the other person's vulnerability in return, creating an escalating spiral of mutual openness that feels almost inevitable in its progression. Imagine sitting with someone you've just met, perhaps at a social gathering or in a professional setting, and they share something moderately personal about themselves, maybe mentioning a fear they have or a recent struggle they've faced. In that moment, something shifts in your perception of the interaction, and you find yourself naturally inclined to match their level of openness, sharing something of similar emotional weight from your own life, not necessarily because you plan to do so, but because the psychological principle of reciprocity has activated within you. This tendency toward reciprocal self-disclosure operates on a fundamental principle of human social bonding, where vulnerability appears to signal trust, and that signal triggers an automatic response in our brains that compels us to reciprocate with our own vulnerability. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon stems from our deeply ingrained social programming that interprets emotional openness as a form of investment in the relationship, as if the other person is saying, "I am willing to risk being seen as flawed in front of you," which our minds instinctively interpret as both an honor and an implicit contract. When someone discloses something personal, they are essentially extending a form of social credit that places us in a subtle state of indebtedness, a feeling that the most natural way to repay that debt is by offering our own authentic revelation in exchange. Yet what makes this psychological mechanism particularly interesting is how it persists and feels entirely natural even when we recognize its mechanical nature. Even after understanding that this pattern is a well-documented aspect of human interaction that can be deliberately triggered without genuine intention. We continue to engage in reciprocal self-disclosure with the same sense of authentic connection, even after acknowledging that the process itself is somewhat automatic and predictable, suggesting that the feeling of genuine bonding might matter more to our nervous systems than the actual logical basis for that bonding. This normalization of reciprocal self-disclosure creates a strange social world where we can simultaneously understand that someone might be employing this tactic, while still feeling the genuine warmth and connection that emerges from the exchange itself. The result is that we find ourselves in relationships, both intimate and casual, where the scaffolding of reciprocal disclosure creates a structure that feels emotionally authentic even when we know it to be partly mechanical. A paradox that reveals how our need for genuine connection can coexist with the knowledge that the pathways to that connection follow predictable patterns. There exists a peculiar phenomenon that occurs when a person takes pen to paper and writes down a commitment, a goal, or even a simple promise to themselves about what they will accomplish the following day. And in doing so, they experience a subtle but measurable shift in their psychological state that makes falling asleep considerably easier. The act of writing something down, particularly before bed, creates a cognitive offloading effect where the mind recognizes that the information has been externalized and stored in a physical or digital location, which allows the brain to release its grip on the thought pattern that has been circulating endlessly through consciousness. When someone sits at their bedside or desk and writes out their intentions for tomorrow, their written words become a kind of contract with themselves, a tangible representation of their will that exists independently of their fluctuating mental energy. This written commitment serves as a psychological anchor that tells the brain that the responsibility has been transferred from active memory to permanent record, and therefore there is no longer an urgent need to keep rehearsing these thoughts in a state of semi-wakefulness. The mechanism at work here involves the brain's natural tendency to protect information that feels important but unsecured, which is why people lie awake rehearsing their worries, their tasks, and their goals over and over again in what researchers call the Zeigarnik Effect, where unfinished or unresolved matters demand cognitive attention. However, once something is written down, the brain perceives it as secure and completed in a preliminary sense, which satisfies that protective instinct and allows neural activity to settle into the slower rhythms associated with sleep onset. What makes this phenomenon particularly interesting is how persistently effective it remains even though most people understand intellectually that writing something down does not actually change their ability to remember it or accomplish it. And yet the brain continues to respond to this symbolic gesture as though it were a genuine transfer of responsibility, demonstrating how deeply our psychology is intertwined with ritual, symbolism, and the tangible representation of our intentions. Perhaps this is why cultures across history have developed ritualistic practices around written vows, contracts, and declarations. The human mind has always intuited that the act of writing transforms the ethereal into the concrete, converting fleeting intention into something that feels almost irreversible. And in that transformation, we find not just better sleep, but a deeper commitment to the person we promised ourselves we would become. And so when we finally close the notebook and extinguish the light, we are not merely surrendering to sleep. We are placing our faith in the power of words to hold us accountable, to bridge the gap between who we are and who we wish to become, trusting that tomorrow, when we read those carefully penned lines, they will call us back to ourselves with the same quiet insistence that allowed us to rest. When you find yourself lying in bed unable to sleep, your mind racing with thoughts and your body restless with tension, you might unconsciously begin to slow down your internal dialogue, gradually matching the cadence of something external around you, perhaps a partner's breathing, the distant hum of traffic, or a voice from a podcast playing softly in the background. This subtle act of mimicking speech pace or rhythmic patterns becomes one of the most underappreciated psychological mechanisms we employ when attempting to drift towards sleep. Yet it operates so seamlessly that most people never consciously recognize it is happening. The human brain is fundamentally wired to synchronize with external rhythms and patterns, a phenomenon deeply rooted in our evolutionary development when matching the pace of a group or environment meant safety and belonging. When we listen to someone speaking slowly and deliberately, or when we deliberately slow our own internal monologue to match a measured breathing pattern, our nervous system begins to interpret this synchronization as a signal that the environment is safe and calm, which in turn triggers a cascade of physiological responses that naturally support the onset of sleep. Our heart rate begins to align with these slower patterns, our breath deepens to match external rhythms, and our brainwave activity gradually shifts from the faster frequencies associated with wakefulness toward the slower frequencies characteristic of drowsiness and sleep. This mechanism is so powerful that even when we intellectually understand sleep should be approached with logic and direct effort, we find ourselves naturally gravitating toward these rhythmic, patterned inputs that allow our minds to surrender control and follow along rather than maintain the exhausting work of conscious thought. The persistence of this behavior across virtually all human cultures and throughout recorded history suggests that mimicking speech pace and external rhythms is not merely a learned habit, but rather a fundamental aspect of how our brains interpret safety and prepare for the vulnerable state of sleep, making it one of the most ancient and reliable psychological tools we possess for the journey from wakefulness into unconsciousness. Consider how a parent's soft voice reading a bedtime story, a meditation guide's unhurried instructions, or even the measured cadence of rain against a window can all serve as external pacemakers that literally reshape our internal rhythms, transforming the chaos of an overactive mind into a gentle, synchronized flow that carries us toward sleep. This synchronization is so effective precisely because it removes the burden of choice. Rather than wrestling with the decision to sleep, we simply allow ourselves to be carried along by an external rhythm, transforming what feels like a loss of control into a gentle surrender that paradoxically makes sleep more attainable than any conscious effort ever could. Consider the moment when you glance at the clock and realize you have exactly 30 minutes before you must fall asleep. Or perhaps you notice it is already past midnight and you have only 6 hours remaining before your alarm will sound. And in that instant, your mind shifts into a particular mode of operation where the scarcity of available time suddenly becomes the dominant frame through which you experience the present moment. This time pressure framing is a subtle psychological mechanism that operates beneath conscious awareness, creating a sense of urgency around the act of falling asleep itself, as if sleep is a commodity that must be secured before it becomes entirely unavailable. When you focus on how little time remains, your brain naturally begins to calculate the mathematical deficit between the present moment and your required wake time. And this mental arithmetic itself becomes a preoccupation that keeps your nervous system engaged and alert at precisely the moment when you are trying to achieve the opposite state. The psychological principle at work here involves what researchers call temporal scarcity, which essentially means that anything perceived as limited in quantity becomes more psychologically salient and more anxiety-inducing, regardless of whether that scarcity actually poses a real threat to your well-being. Your mind interprets the countdown as a challenge to be solved, transforming sleep from a natural biological process into a goal-oriented task with measurable consequences. And this reframing fundamentally changes your neurological state from one of relaxation toward one of problem-solving and performance pressure. What makes this mechanism particularly persistent is that it appears to have rational foundation. Logically, you do need sleep before your alarm sounds, and mathematically, there is indeed a finite window of time available, yet this rational observation obscures the fact that anxiously monitoring the time remaining actively prevents the very outcome you are trying to achieve. We have normalized this strange temporal awareness in bedtime culture to such a degree that most people experience it as simply an unavoidable feature of adult life, rather than recognizing it as a self-imposed psychological trap that systematically undermines sleep quality night after night. The irony deepens when you recognize that the time you spend lying awake worrying about insufficient sleep time is time that could have been spent actually sleeping. Yet this circular logic rarely penetrates the urgency felt in the moment, and instead you remain trapped in a meta-anxiety where concern about your sleep deficit becomes the very mechanism that creates it. The paradox becomes even more entrenched when you consider that breaking free from this trap requires you to somehow stop caring about the time remaining, to release your grip on the very metric that feels most urgent and real, which itself feels dangerous, as though you're surrendering your last tool for ensuring adequate sleep. Yet this surrender, counterintuitive as it seems, is precisely what your nervous system needs in order to transition from the vigilant, time-tracking state back into the biological readiness for sleep. The human mind has always possessed a peculiar affinity for patterns that arrive in groups of three, a preference so deeply embedded in our cognitive architecture that we rarely pause to question why this particular number holds such magnetic appeal across nearly every domain of human experience and culture. When you listen to storytellers, whether they are ancient orators recounting myths or modern comedians delivering punchlines, you will notice that the most memorable and satisfying narratives tend to follow a structure of three distinct elements, where the first two establish expectation, the third delivers resolution or surprise, and this sequence creates a sense of completeness that our brains find profoundly satisfying. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this preference stems from the fact that the number two can feel incomplete or create tension, as though we are waiting for something else to arrive and resolve the ambiguity. But when a third element appears, our minds experience a sensation of wholeness and closure that triggers a release of tension and a settling into contentment. This phenomenon extends far beyond storytelling into the realm of arguments and persuasion, where three supporting points feel substantially more convincing than two, even when the third point might be logically weaker than either of the first two, because our brains interpret the triangular structure as stable and complete rather than precarious. The reason this rule persists so powerfully in human consciousness relates to the fundamental way our pattern recognition systems evolved, designed to identify stable configurations in nature and to trust structures that exhibited balance and symmetry. And the triangle remains the most structurally stable geometric form found throughout the natural world. As you drift towards sleep, allowing your mind to rest on triads of related concepts or memories, your consciousness naturally settles into the comfortable rhythm that this numerical pattern creates, finding peace in the sense of completion and balance that three things provide rather than the unresolved tension that might accompany two, or the overwhelming complexity that might arrive with four or more elements vying for your attention. In this way, the rule of three becomes not merely a stylistic preference, but a fundamental attunement to how our brains organize experience itself, which is why the pattern emerges everywhere from religious trinities to corporate mission statements to the classic beginning, middle, and end structure that has shaped human storytelling since language first evolved to bind communities together through shared narrative understanding. And perhaps most remarkably, this preference operates so invisibly that we remain largely unaware of how profoundly it shapes our judgments, our memories, and our sense of what feels true or complete, making the rule of three not simply a quirk of human psychology, but rather an invisible architecture upon which we have constructed meaning itself. Consider the subtle power of how a single situation can be presented in two fundamentally different ways, each one triggering an entirely different emotional and psychological response within us, even though the underlying reality remains precisely the same. Imagine you are reading about a medical procedure, and in one version you are told that it has a 90% success rate, while in another version you are told that it has a 10% failure rate. Both statements contain identical information, yet the first framing makes you feel significantly more confident and willing to proceed, while the second framing creates hesitation and anxiety. This is framing effects in action, a cognitive phenomenon where the way information is presented fundamentally alters how we perceive, evaluate, and respond to that information, bypassing our logical reasoning entirely. The mechanism operates because our brains do not process information in a purely objective manner. Instead, we unconsciously accept the frame that is presented to us as the reference point, and all subsequent judgments are made relative to that established frame. When something is framed positively, highlighting gains and benefits, we become more inclined to take risks and move forward. When that same thing is framed negatively, emphasizing losses and dangers, we become more risk-averse and cautious. This is not a conscious choice we make. It happens automatically within the deeper layers of our cognition, beneath the level of deliberate thought. What makes framing effects particularly persistent and pervasive is that even when we are fully aware of this psychological principle, even when we understand intellectually that both frames represent the same reality, we still find ourselves swayed by the framing. A glass described as half full feels different from a glass described as half empty, and this difference persists despite our complete awareness of the illusion. We have normalized this susceptibility so thoroughly that we rarely question why a particular frame was chosen, or who benefits from presenting information in one way rather than another. Marketers, politicians, and communicators of all kinds leverage framing effects constantly, and we accept these reframings as natural variations in how people communicate rather than as attempts to manipulate our perception. The power of framing becomes even more apparent when we consider how the same policy, say a tax increase, can be presented either as an investment in public welfare or as government overreach, fundamentally shifting public opinion without a single fact changing. In this way, framing effects are not merely a curious glitch in human reasoning. They are a primary mechanism through which reality itself is constructed and contested in the social world. The deeper we look, the more we recognize that there is no view from nowhere. Every presentation of information emerges from some perspective, some set of values and interests, and once we understand this, we begin to see framing not as an aberration, but as an inescapable feature of how human meaning is created and negotiated. There is something profoundly calming about positioning yourself in a corner of a room, whether it is the junction where two walls meet in your bedroom, a corner of your living room sofa, or even the corner booth at a quiet restaurant where the walls form a protective barrier behind and beside you. When you sit in a corner, your visual field becomes naturally constrained, your peripheral awareness knows exactly where the boundaries are, and there is an unmistakable sense of enclosure that seems to wrap around you like an invisible blanket. This simple act of spatial positioning has become so ordinary that most people never consciously register why they are drawn to corners when they want to rest, relax, or prepare for sleep. Yet the behavior persists across cultures and age groups with remarkable consistency. The psychological mechanism at work here is rooted in our evolutionary heritage as creatures who experienced vulnerability when exposed from multiple directions simultaneously. When you sit in a corner, your brain receives a continuous stream of safety signals because the number of directions from which a threat could theoretically emerge is reduced by half, and this reduction in potential danger creates a measurable decrease in baseline vigilance that your nervous system maintains. Your eyes do not need to scan as wide an area, your startle response can operate with a lower threshold of activation, and your mind is freed from the subtle exhaustion of maintaining perimeter awareness. Additionally, corners create what researchers in environmental psychology call bounded spaces, and bounded spaces activate the parasympathetic nervous system more readily than open, exposed spaces do, effectively initiating a cascade of physiological changes that prepare your body for sleep. The peculiar persistence of this behavior despite its ancient origins is that corner sitting remains effective even in modern environments where actual physical threats have become statistically minimal, suggesting that our psychology has not updated itself to match our safety, and instead continues to operate according to scripts written by survival needs that no longer apply in most of our daily lives. Which means that even as we sit in our secure homes surrounded by locks and walls and the ambient glow of safety, we still gravitate toward corners because somewhere deep within our neural architecture, the message remains clear that fewer directions to guard means more rest is possible. This is why the person who always claims the corner table at dinner, or who positions their chair facing the room from its furthest edge, is not being antisocial, but rather honoring an ancient calculus of comfort. They have simply learned, perhaps without consciously knowing it, that safety and relaxation are not opposites of each other but rather prerequisites, and that the corner is where the body can finally exhale. When you listen to someone speaking at a deliberately reduced pace, with elongated vowels and extended pauses between phrases, something peculiar begins to happen within your nervous system that has little to do with the actual content being communicated, and everything to do with the rhythmic patterns your brain perceives as safe and non-threatening. This technique, which appears frequently in guided meditations, audiobooks designed for sleep, and even in the voices of certain late-night radio hosts, works because our brains are fundamentally designed to process rapid speech as a signal of urgency or potential danger, whereas slow speech triggers the opposite neural cascade. When someone deliberately stretches their words and allows silence to linger between sentences, they are essentially creating temporal space that your mind interprets as a lack of threat, which permits your sympathetic nervous system to downshift and your parasympathetic nervous system to gradually take control. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what researchers call temporal processing, wherein the brain's perception of time and rhythm directly influences emotional regulation and arousal levels, much the same way a steady heartbeat soothes an infant or a slowly ticking clock can feel hypnotic during late hours. Your mind, which ordinarily races forward trying to anticipate what will be said next in normal conversation, is forced to slow down and simply exist in the present moment when confronted with extended pauses and drawn-out phonemes, creating a state of minimal cognitive load that resembles the mental patterns observed during the early stages of sleep onset. Despite the fact that there is absolutely no logical reason why the speed at which someone arranges their words should have any bearing whatsoever on your ability to enter a sleep state, we have collectively normalized and accepted this technique as one of the most reliable tools for inducing drowsiness, embedding slow speech into countless sleep applications, meditation programs, and bedtime audio content without ever questioning why this simple manipulation of speech tempo exerts such a powerful influence over our consciousness and our capacity to surrender to sleep. The irony is that once you become aware of this mechanism, once you consciously recognize that you are being deliberately lulled into a state of compliance through the modulation of speech patterns, the technique often loses much of its potency because your analytical mind reasserts itself and begins to deconstruct the very rhythm that was meant to silence its constant vigilance. Yet there exists a paradox within this paradox. Those who listen with full acceptance of the mechanism, who surrender to it without resistance or self-consciousness, often find that the technique works most effectively precisely because they have stopped trying to deconstruct it, suggesting that the power of deliberate slow speech may ultimately depend less on the rhythm itself and more on our willingness to be vulnerable to its influence. When you listen carefully to how people speak throughout their day, you'll notice a peculiar pattern that emerges almost universally: the tendency to end declarative statements with a downward inflection in the voice, a vocal pattern that mirrors the natural fall of pitch associated with finality and certainty. This phenomenon, which linguists and speech therapists have observed for decades, involves the speaker's pitch dropping at the end of a sentence, creating an acoustic signal that communicates closure, authority, and the natural completion of a thought or idea. In everyday conversation, whether someone is stating a simple fact like, "I finished my work today," or making a more complex assertion about their plans or beliefs, there exists this unconscious inclination to lower the tone of voice on the final word or syllable, which sends a subtle but powerful signal to the listener that the statement is conclusive and requires no further elaboration. The mechanism behind this behavior appears to be deeply rooted in how human communication evolved, as the falling pitch contour naturally signals to our brains that a complete thought has been expressed, much like the period at the end of a written sentence provides visual closure to a reader. This downward inflection works because it aligns with our innate understanding of musical and tonal patterns, where descending melodies feel resolved and complete, whereas rising pitches create tension and suggest continuation or questioning. The psychological impact of this vocal pattern is significant. When speakers end their statements with this downward cadence, they unconsciously project confidence and finality, while listeners interpret this falling tone as an indicator that the speaker is certain about what they've just said and that the turn to speak has naturally concluded. Over time, this communication pattern has become so deeply embedded in how we interact that we rarely question why we do it. And yet it remains one of the most fundamental tools through which we signal meaning and establish conversational boundaries without ever explicitly discussing these rules or even being aware that we're following them. Interestingly, when people deviate from this pattern, ending statements with an upward inflection, known as uptalk, listeners often perceive the speaker as uncertain, questioning, or seeking validation, even when the speaker intends to convey a definitive claim. This demonstrates how profoundly our vocal patterns shape not just what we communicate, but how our credibility and confidence are interpreted by those around us. Understanding this distinction becomes particularly practical in professional settings, where job interviews, presentations, and negotiations are often won or lost based on vocal delivery. A candidate who consistently ends statements with that authoritative downward inflection is more likely to be perceived as competent and trustworthy, while the same information delivered with rising inflections may undermine the speaker's credibility despite the factual accuracy of their words. The cold read is a subtle psychological mechanism that operates whenever someone makes a generalized statement about you that feels oddly specific and accurate, creating an immediate sense of recognition and connection that makes you more susceptible to their influence or ideas. Consider the scenario where you're lying in bed at night, unable to sleep, and you begin scrolling through your phone or listening to a podcast, and the speaker or content says something like, "You're probably the kind of person who overthinks things at night," or "Most people don't realize they're anxious until they try to fall asleep." And suddenly you feel seen, understood, and oddly comforted because the statement seems to describe your exact experience with uncanny precision. What makes the cold read so psychologically powerful is that it exploits a cognitive bias called the Barnum Effect, where people tend to accept vague or general statements as uniquely describing themselves when they're presented as personal or specific observations, combined with the natural human tendency to recognize patterns and fill in gaps with our own experiences and memories. When someone makes a broad statement that could apply to many people, but frames it in a way that feels directed at you specifically, your brain immediately searches your own life for confirmation, finding countless examples that validate the observation, which creates a false sense of genuine personal insight and understanding that has actually been generated primarily by your own mind rather than by any special knowledge the speaker possesses. The cold read persists so effectively in our culture despite being logically insubstantial because it addresses a fundamental human need to feel understood and recognized, especially during vulnerable moments like the quiet hours before sleep when our defenses are lowered and our minds are more susceptible to suggestion and emotional resonance. And we have collectively normalized this mechanism to such an extent that we rarely question whether the insight offered to us is actually personalized or merely a reflection of our own projections and desires for connection. The insidious elegance of the cold read lies in its self-reinforcing nature. The more we believe we've been truly seen, the more readily we accept subsequent statements from that source, creating a feedback loop where our own investment in the connection makes us increasingly blind to the mechanism's essential emptiness. This is precisely why cold reads are the foundational tool of fortune tellers, self-help gurus, and anyone seeking to establish rapid intimacy and influence without requiring any genuine knowledge of who we actually are. Once you recognize this mechanism at work, you begin to notice it everywhere, in therapy sessions that feel revelatory, in horoscopes that seem uncannily accurate, in social media algorithms that serve you content so perfectly tailored it feels like someone knows your soul. And this awareness itself becomes a kind of inoculation, allowing you to appreciate genuine connection while remaining skeptical of the seductive comfort that comes too easily and asks too little in return. When you lie down to sleep, your hands naturally curl into fists, fingers folding inward as your body settles into what feels like a protective stance. Yet research into relaxation and the parasympathetic nervous system suggests that deliberately opening your palms flat against the mattress or at your sides can trigger a measurable shift in your psychological state toward deeper rest. The act of opening your palms is fundamentally about vulnerability and release, because when your hands are closed, your nervous system interprets this as a state of preparation, defense, or tension, a holdover from our evolutionary past when clenched fists meant we were ready to protect ourselves or react to threat. Your body reads an open palm as the opposite signal. There is nothing to defend against, no need to prepare, no danger lurking that requires your muscles to remain coiled and ready. When you consciously flatten your hands with fingers spread slightly apart, you are essentially broadcasting to your own nervous system that you have surrendered to the moment, that you trust your environment enough to leave yourself in this vulnerable position, and this signal ripples through your body's entire stress response mechanism, downregulating cortisol production and allowing your breathing to deepen and slow naturally. The pressure points in your palms are connected to numerous nerve pathways that communicate directly with your brain, and when your palms are open rather than clenched, these pathways are less stimulated in the way that tension creates, meaning less constant low-level signaling that something requires your attention. Yet despite understanding these mechanisms, most people continue to sleep with their hands in whatever position feels unconsciously natural, rarely pausing to consider that such a simple adjustment might be the difference between lying awake for hours and drifting peacefully into sleep within minutes. As though the body's instinct for self-protection is so deeply embedded that we must consciously override it with intention and awareness. The practice of opening your palms, then, becomes a quiet act of rebellion against your own evolutionary programming, a nightly choice to tell your ancient nervous system that safety is not something you must grip tightly, but something you can finally, deliberately let go of. And so, over time, as you practice this small gesture night after night, your body begins to learn a new language of safety, one written not in the grip of your fingers, but in the openness of your palms, until eventually your hands fall naturally into that vulnerable, restful position and sleep comes without the struggle. When you finally wake from such sleep, your palms may bear the faint impression of the mattress weave, a small physical reminder that you spent the night in genuine repose, and you might notice your shoulders sit lower, your jaw unclenched, your entire posture carrying forward that permission you gave yourself to simply be safe without fighting for it. There exists a peculiar moment in the evening when a person transitions from the active, vertical posture of their day into the seated position. And in doing so, they initiate a cascade of neurological and psychological shifts that prepare the body for sleep without conscious intention or awareness. This act of simply sitting down, particularly in a designated comfort space like a couch or armchair, functions as a powerful signal to the nervous system that the demands of constant vigilance and readiness are beginning to diminish, creating what can be understood as a physical permission slip to relax. When we remain standing throughout our day, our muscles maintain a certain baseline tension. Our attention remains distributed across our environment in preparation for movement or reaction, and our stress hormones like cortisol continue to circulate at elevated levels that reflect our readiness for action and engagement with the world around us. The moment we deliberately sit down, however, we communicate to our brain through proprioceptive feedback and the simple act of reducing our gravitational burden that we are entering a different mode of existence, one where we do not need to be prepared to flee or fight or handle emergencies at a moment's notice. Our muscles begin their initial process of tension release, our visual field naturally narrows somewhat as our perspective shifts lower, and our body weight becomes supported by something other than our own muscular effort, which itself feels like a fundamental relief from an obligation we have been carrying all day long. This mechanism operates largely beneath conscious awareness, which is perhaps why it remains so effective despite the fact that we could logically sit down at any point during our waking hours, and yet we reserve this gesture most powerfully for the evening, when we have already mentally decided that our productive day is concluding. We rarely question why the simple change in position carries such weight in our psychology, why our brain has learned to associate sitting with the beginning of shutdown, or how a species that evolved to remain vigilant even while resting has developed such a strong Pavlovian response to a mere postural adjustment. Yet we continue to rely on this subtle trick, this nearly invisible signal that transforms our state from alert to increasingly at ease, and we do so repeatedly without ever truly examining why the position of our skeleton in space should matter so profoundly to the neurotransmitters and hormonal cascades that govern our sleep onset. Perhaps this is why the act feels so sacred in our evening routines, because it represents one of the few moments when we consciously surrender our readiness to the world, when we permit ourselves to become, in a sense, temporarily vulnerable and defenseless, and in that surrender, we finally allow the accumulated tension of the day to begin its slow release into the cushions beneath us. When you find yourself lying in bed unable to sleep, your mind often reaches for a peculiar comfort mechanism. The repetition of a single phrase, thought, or concept over and over again, as though the sheer frequency of encountering the same information will somehow bore your consciousness into submission. You might repeat a calming affirmation like, "I am relaxed, I am safe, I am relaxed, I am safe." Or you might find yourself mentally rehearsing the same memory or imagining the same peaceful scenario repeatedly, cycling through the identical details each time as though watching the same film reel projected onto the inside of your eyelids. This act of repetition operates on a surprisingly sophisticated psychological principle. The mind, when confronted with familiar and predictable patterns, begins to lower its guard and reduces the metabolic effort required to process novel information. When something repeats, your brain essentially recognizes that no new threat or stimulus is emerging, and consequently, it gradually disengages from the active state of alertness that keeps you awake. The repetition also serves to drown out the intrusive, racing thoughts that typically plague insomniacs, replacing them with a controlled mental loop that requires just enough cognitive engagement to distract you from worries, yet remains monotonous enough to feel calming rather than stimulating. What makes this psychological trick particularly curious is that we rarely acknowledge how deeply normalized this behavior has become in sleep culture, from guided meditations that deliberately repeat mantras to the universal practice of counting sheep. Yet few people genuinely consider why monotonous repetition works so effectively at quieting the mind. Perhaps the deepest irony is that the very mechanism we use to escape our thoughts, the deliberate, almost meditative focus on repetition, mirrors the way anxiety itself operates, cycling endlessly through the same worries, suggesting that sleep and wakefulness are separated not by the content of our thoughts, but merely by whether we have chosen to orchestrate their repetition ourselves. In this way, the insomniac becomes both the conductor and the audience of their own mental symphony, choosing which notes to repeat until the repetition itself becomes a lullaby. It is a reminder that sometimes the path to peace lies not in silencing the mind entirely, but in giving it permission to settle into a rhythm so familiar that it finally feels safe enough to rest. And so the next time you find yourself trapped in that twilight space between wakefulness and sleep, you might recognize that your desperate mental loops, whether they take the form of counting, mantras, or visualized scenes, are not failures of the mind, but rather its most elegant surrender, a deliberate choice to transform the noise of consciousness into something ordered enough to dissolve into silence. In this surrender, you discover that the repetition you feared, the endless loop that once seemed like a symptom of sleeplessness, becomes instead your greatest ally, a gentle anchor that holds your wandering mind in place until consciousness finally releases its grip and allows you to drift into the mercy of sleep. Consider the moment when someone is speaking to you about something they believe in deeply, and you notice they begin to nod their head rhythmically as they talk, their chin moving up and down in gentle agreement with their own words, as if their body is validating each sentence before it even leaves their mouth. This is a phenomenon so universally practiced that we rarely pause to examine why it happens or what it actually accomplishes in the moment. When a person nods while speaking, they are engaging in a subtle form of self-persuasion, a physical reinforcement of the narrative they are constructing in real time. The nodding creates an embodied confirmation, a kinesthetic agreement between the speaker's body and the content of their speech, which serves to strengthen their own conviction in what they are saying. Psychologically, this behavior taps into something called embodied cognition, the principle that our physical movements and bodily states directly influence our thoughts and emotional states, meaning that the act of nodding while speaking actually makes the speaker feel more confident, more certain, and more committed to the words flowing from their mouth. The listener, observing this nodding, unconsciously interprets it as a sign of confidence and authenticity, even though the speaker may have simply been engaging in an automatic physical behavior that has nothing to do with the logical validity of what they are saying. What becomes fascinating is how we have normalized this gesture to such an extent that we expect it, we trust people more when they do it, and we ourselves compulsively perform it without conscious awareness, all while understanding on some logical level that a person's physical gestures have no bearing on whether their statement is actually true or false. Yet the behavior persists, generation after generation, reinforced by our tendency to associate nodding with agreement and confidence, creating a feedback loop where speakers nod to convince themselves and listeners interpret that nodding as evidence of genuine belief. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves most persuaded not by the logic of an argument, but by the embodied certainty of the person delivering it. Why a salesman's nod sells more effectively than a spreadsheet's numbers, and why we instinctively nod back in conversation, caught in a mutual dance of physical affirmation that feels like understanding even when it might simply be synchronization. In this way, nodding while speaking becomes a kind of social currency, a physical claim of authenticity that we have collectively agreed to honor, even as we recognize, somewhere in the back of our minds, that the gesture itself is merely theater, a performance of conviction that has somehow become indistinguishable from conviction itself. And yet we continue to nod, in job interviews and confessions, in arguments we're losing and truths we're discovering. Because somewhere in our evolution, we learned that the body's agreement matters as much as the mind's, that conviction is not merely thought but movement, and that perhaps the line between performing belief and actually believing it was always far more blurred than we care to admit. When we listen to someone speak with intentional clarity and purpose, removing the constant stream of filler words like like, you know, and basically, something remarkable happens to our cognitive load and mental engagement. Our brains require less effort to process the information being delivered because there are no unnecessary pauses or placeholder sounds interrupting the flow of meaning. And this reduced cognitive demand creates a subtle but profound sense of ease that can extend into our evening routines and sleep preparation. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what researchers call cognitive fluency, which is the ease with which our minds can process and understand information, and when speech flows smoothly without these linguistic interruptions, our brains naturally relax into a state of lower mental strain. Filler words serve no communicative purpose whatsoever, and yet they create tiny moments of friction in our listening experience, moments where our brains must briefly pause or backtrack to understand what was actually being said, and each of these small disruptions, multiplied across a conversation or listening session, accumulates into genuine mental fatigue. When we deliberately choose to eliminate these verbal crutches from our own speech, or when we seek out speakers and content creators who have already mastered this skill, we expose ourselves to an audio environment that feels inherently more organized, more intentional, and more structured. This clarity of communication triggers a sense of order in our minds, activating the parasympathetic nervous system because our brains recognize that the speaker is in control and knows exactly what they want to say, which paradoxically makes us feel more safe and settled. The remarkable thing is that despite having no logical reason to find filler words necessary for actual comprehension, they have become so normalized in everyday speech across most cultures that we barely notice them anymore, and we certainly do not consciously recognize how they tire our minds. Yet when we encounter speech stripped of these verbal hesitations, we suddenly become aware of just how much mental effort we were previously expending, and this discovery can be genuinely restful to experience. The gift of this awareness is that you can then intentionally curate your media consumption, choosing podcasts hosted by articulate speakers, audiobooks narrated by professionals who have trained to speak with precision, or even conversations with people who naturally communicate without verbal clutter. And in doing so, you create an acoustic environment that actively supports your relaxation rather than subtly undermining it. This practice of mindful listening becomes a form of self-care in itself, a deliberate decision to protect your mental resources during hours when your nervous system is already winding down. And over time, this accumulated reduction in cognitive friction can meaningfully improve both the quality of your sleep and your ability to transition peacefully into rest. Have you ever noticed how your posture shifts the moment you feel self-conscious in a social situation, or how you naturally straighten your spine when someone you admire walks into the room? There is something deeply embedded in our physical responses to authority, confidence, and social hierarchy that manifests through the simple act of standing taller. When we encounter someone we perceive as more powerful, more accomplished, or more credible than ourselves, our bodies often respond before our conscious minds have fully processed the interaction. We pull our shoulders back, we extend our necks, we lengthen our spines, and in doing so, we are engaging in a subtle form of physical self-presentation that has roots far deeper than modern etiquette. This isn't simply about looking more composed or collected in front of others, though that is certainly part of the equation. Rather, it represents a fundamental psychological mechanism through which we navigate social structures and communicate nonverbally about our own sense of place within them. The mechanism behind this behavior operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the most immediate level, standing taller quite literally makes us occupy more physical space, which our brains associate with power, dominance, and presence. Studies in social psychology have demonstrated that posture actually influences our own internal states of confidence and hormonal balance, suggesting that when we stand taller, we aren't just projecting confidence outward, but we're also genuinely affecting our internal emotional landscape. Additionally, standing taller places us at a different eye level relative to those around us, and this subtle shift in vertical positioning triggers ancient social recognition patterns in our brains that relate to physical stature, health, and potential threat assessment. When we straighten our posture, we are unconsciously signaling to both ourselves and others that we are present, engaged, and worthy of attention. What makes this behavior so remarkably persistent is the fact that it happens almost entirely outside of our conscious awareness. We are not actively thinking about the biomechanics of spinal alignment or the evolutionary origins of height-based social hierarchies when we straighten our posture in an important meeting or a first date. Yet the behavior continues, refined through countless generations of human social interaction, embedded so deeply in our neurobiology that it feels as natural and involuntary as breathing. We have normalized this constant physical negotiation of our social standing so thoroughly that we rarely pause to question why a simple change in vertical positioning should carry such psychological weight, yet we continue to engage in this subtle dance of elevation and descent throughout every single day. The teenager who slouches when criticized suddenly straightens when praised, the employee who hunches at their desk sits upright in the presence of their CEO, the person nursing self-doubt who finds themselves lifting their chin just slightly higher when they decide, in that moment, that they deserve to take up space. When you enter a waiting room, a bus, a cafe, or any space with multiple empty seats arranged in a row, there exists a peculiar phenomenon that most people follow without conscious awareness, one that reveals something fundamental about human psychology and our relationship with proximity and comfort. Rather than selecting the first available seat closest to the entrance or the obvious choice, people tend to choose the second seat in a sequence, effectively bypassing what is technically the most accessible option and instead selecting what feels psychologically safer or more intentional. This behavior manifests across countless environments, whether you're waiting for a doctor's appointment, boarding public transportation, or sitting in a nearly empty restaurant, and it persists with remarkable consistency despite the fact that the first seat offers no inherent disadvantage and would logically be the most efficient choice in terms of minimizing walking distance. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this choice involves several overlapping factors that work together to create this preference, beginning with the human need to feel as though we are making an active decision rather than simply accepting the default option, which means that passing by the first seat allows us to exercise agency and assert our autonomy even in the most mundane of circumstances. Additionally, choosing the second seat creates a subtle buffer that distances us from the entrance or threshold, a liminal space that functions psychologically as a transition zone where we feel more removed from the disruptive flow of incoming people, noise, and unpredictability, effectively creating a sense of partial sanctuary that the first seat cannot provide. Furthermore, selecting the second seat allows us to maintain a socially acceptable distance from whoever might occupy the first seat should someone arrive after us, and this anticipatory spacing reflects our deeply ingrained social programming around personal space and the invisible boundaries we maintain even in public environments. What makes this behavior particularly interesting is that we have collectively normalized this pattern to such an extent that the first seat has almost become a sort of social antimatter, rarely claimed despite being objectively unoccupied and available, transforming a simple spatial choice into a complex social signal that communicates something about our awareness, our consideration, and our participation in an unspoken social contract. Most people never consciously acknowledge that they are doing this, yet they do it repeatedly across their lifetimes, reinforcing a pattern that has no logical foundation but exists purely as a psychological preference that has been internalized through social observation and normalization. And in this way, the second seat represents one of countless microbehaviors through which we navigate the world according to invisible rules we did not consciously choose but somehow understand perfectly. There exists a peculiar ritual that many people engage in during the evening hours when preparing their spaces for sleep, one that involves the deliberate and intentional placement of objects in specific locations around the bedroom or bedside area. You might notice someone carefully positioning their phone on the nightstand at a particular angle, arranging pillows in a certain configuration, placing a glass of water at arm's reach, positioning their alarm clock so the numbers face away from direct view, or setting their keys, wallet, and watch in a predetermined spot where they can be found immediately upon waking. This behavior extends beyond mere organization or practical necessity, as these individuals often spend considerably more time arranging and rearranging these items than would be logically required for their functional purpose. The act of placing objects deliberately appears to create a sense of environmental control and predictability that somehow facilitates the transition into sleep, even though the actual placement of a phone or glass of water should theoretically have no bearing on one's ability to fall asleep. The psychological mechanism underlying this behavior seems to involve the establishment of ritualistic control within the sleep environment, where the deliberate placement of objects serves as a form of environmental mastery that reduces anxiety about the unknown or uncontrolled aspects of the night ahead. When a person knows exactly where every essential item is located without needing to search or fumble in darkness, there emerges a baseline sense of security and preparedness that allows the mind to release some of its vigilant monitoring functions. Additionally, the repetitive nature of placing objects in the same locations night after night creates a deeply ingrained neural pathway that becomes associated with sleep onset. So the act itself becomes a trigger for the body's sleep mechanisms, regardless of whether the actual placement serves any practical function. We have normalized this behavior so thoroughly that most people do not consciously acknowledge they are engaging in a ritualistic practice, instead viewing it as simple common sense or basic bedroom organization. Yet the consistency and specificity with which individuals replicate this placement pattern suggests something far deeper than mere logistics is at work within the sleeping mind. The moment someone deviates from their established placement pattern, forgetting where they set their phone, or finding their water glass moved to an unfamiliar location, they often experience a subtle but genuine disruption to their sleep quality, a small anxiety that persists until the objects are restored to their rightful positions, confirming that our minds have encoded these placements as essential coordinates in the geography of rest. This phenomenon reveals itself most acutely when traveling, where the absence of familiar placements can trigger insomnia despite physical exhaustion, as though the mind refuses to surrender to sleep until it has reconstructed its customary spatial order in an unfamiliar room. There exists a peculiar habit that many people engage in during moments of anxiety, stress, or when they're trying to wind down for sleep, and that habit involves the simple act of chewing gum in the hours before bed, a practice that seems counterintuitive on the surface, since chewing is a form of active engagement that would theoretically stimulate the mind rather than settle it. Yet millions of people find themselves reaching for a piece of gum when they feel their thoughts racing, or when they need to create a barrier between themselves and their worries, almost as though the mechanical repetition of the chewing motion provides a kind of anchor that keeps their consciousness tethered to something manageable and rhythmic, rather than allowing it to spiral into deeper anxieties. The psychological mechanism at work here operates on several simultaneous levels, beginning with the way that rhythmic, repetitive physical actions naturally calm the nervous system by engaging the parasympathetic response that the body associates with non-threatening, routine activities. And this response is further reinforced by the sensory stimulation that comes from the taste and texture of the gum itself, which provides a consistent focal point that occupies just enough of the mind's attention to interrupt the anxiety loop without requiring full cognitive engagement. Additionally, the act of chewing triggers the release of certain neurochemicals, including serotonin and endorphins, which naturally elevate mood and reduce stress responses, while the mechanical action of jaw movement also releases tension that accumulates in the facial muscles and jaw during periods of emotional distress, creating a genuine physiological relaxation that extends beyond mere psychological comfort. What remains fascinating is how normalized and accepted this behavior has become, despite the fact that we rarely question why something as seemingly random as chewing flavored rubber should have any therapeutic effect whatsoever. Yet we've collectively integrated it into our pre-sleep routines, our study sessions, our waiting rooms, and our moments of silent contemplation, treating it as though it were a time-honored practice rather than a relatively modern habit that emerged alongside the mass production of chewing gum in the 20th century. And this persistence suggests that we've discovered something genuinely effective about the practice, even if we haven't fully articulated why it works or what deeper need it satisfies within our increasingly overstimulated minds. Perhaps what we're ultimately discovering through this humble ritual is that in a world of constant digital stimulation and information overload, the simple, analog act of chewing gum offers us permission to be quietly engaged without being intellectually demanded upon, a form of productive doing that asks nothing of us but presence, and in that permission, we find a kind of freedom. Consider the moment when someone asks you a question that contains multiple interpretations, and instead of seeking clarification, you simply nod or offer a vague affirmation like, yeah, or sure, or that sounds good, knowing full well that you haven't actually committed yourself to anything specific because the question itself was so broad that any answer would technically be correct. This happens constantly in human interaction, from a friend asking if you want to hang out sometime, to a colleague asking if you're okay with the new approach, to a family member asking if you'll help out around here. And in each case, you respond affirmatively without ever truly defining what the agreement actually entails or what responsibilities you're assuming. The psychological mechanism at work here is deceptively simple, yet profoundly effective. Ambiguous agreement allows both parties to feel as though understanding has been reached, while simultaneously maintaining plausible deniability about the specifics, which means that if circumstances change, or if one person's interpretation of the agreement differs from the others, each party can retreat to their own understanding without being accused of dishonesty or negligence. Your brain finds this arrangement deeply comforting because it permits you to appear cooperative and engaged without requiring you to establish firm boundaries or make concrete commitments. And there's an almost meditative quality to this linguistic dance, where meaning remains beautifully unresolved and floating in the space between what was said and what was understood. We've normalized this phenomenon so thoroughly that we rarely notice it happening, and we certainly don't recognize how it permeates every social interaction, every work negotiation, every family obligation, every promise made in passing, as though the human species collectively agreed at some point that precision was less valuable than the maintenance of harmonious relationships. And as you drift towards sleep, your mind may recognize that you spend much of your waking life engaged in these unspoken agreements with people around you, never quite committing to anything while somehow committing to everything at once. And perhaps the most unsettling part is recognizing that tomorrow morning, when someone follows up on one of these vague commitments with an interpretation wildly different from your own, you'll experience a moment of genuine confusion. Not because you were dishonest, but because the ambiguity was always the point, a shared fiction that both of you tacitly agreed to maintain until the moment it became inconvenient. And in that moment of confrontation, you'll likely choose to reinterpret your own memory of the conversation rather than admit that ambiguity was mutual. Because accepting that would mean acknowledging that you, too, were complicit in the comfortable fiction, that you needed the agreement to remain undefined just as much as the other person did. So the cycle perpetuates. You'll nod again tomorrow, and the day after, each ambiguous affirmation, a small bargain struck between the comfort of connection and the terror of being truly known. Consider the peculiar ritual that unfolds in the final moments before sleep, when a person deliberately recalls or mentally revisits the last event, conversation, or interaction of their day, almost as though they are consciously selecting which memory will serve as the final image their mind presents before consciousness surrenders to sleep. This act of intentionally curating the last impression occurs across countless bedtime routines, whether someone replays a pleasant conversation with a loved one, mentally rehearses tomorrow's plans in a comforting manner, or deliberately thinks about something amusing or beautiful in those seconds before their eyes close. The mechanism underlying this behavior stems from a profound psychological principle known as the recency effect, combined with what researchers call the serial position effect, wherein the final item in a sequence receives disproportionate cognitive weight and emotional resonance in our memory, becoming the dominant marker of the entire experience. When we consciously serve ourselves this last impression before sleep, we are essentially hijacking our brain's natural tendency to overweight terminal events, deliberately feeding it a specific memory or thought that we hope will become the lasting imprint left in our consciousness as we drift away. This psychological trick works because our brains continue processing information even as we enter the hypnagogic state, the transitional zone between wakefulness and sleep, and whatever occupies that threshold space tends to linger in our neural landscape, coloring our dreams and the quality of our sleep itself. What remains curious is how normalized and unquestioned this behavior has become, for there is something almost counterintuitive about the idea that we can simply select our final conscious thought and expect it to genuinely influence our emotional state and sleep quality. Yet the practice persists universally because on some intuitive level, we recognize that our minds will remember what we feed them last. And we have learned to use this knowledge to our advantage without ever fully understanding the intricate dance of neurotransmitters and memory consolidation that makes it possible. Perhaps this is why bedtime prayers, gratitude practices, and the simple act of mentally rehearsing tomorrow's possibilities have endured across cultures and centuries. They represent humanity's instinctive recognition that the mind's final conscious gift to itself shapes not just sleep, but the emotional tenor of the following day, making the last impression we serve ourselves one of our most consequential daily choices. In this light, the person who deliberately recalls a child's laughter before sleep is not merely seeking comfort. They are architecting their own neurochemistry, understanding intuitively that this final mental offering will reverberate through their sleep cycles and surface again in the morning as a subtle but unmistakable shift in their mood and resilience. We are, in essence, each night's final curator, wielding more power over our own consciousness than we typically acknowledge. When you lie in bed at night unable to sleep, your mind often becomes a restless machine, cycling through the day's events, tomorrow's concerns, and an endless stream of half-formed thoughts that seem to multiply the more you try to suppress them. In this state of heightened mental activity, many people instinctively engage in what might be called deliberate misdirection, a technique where you consciously guide your attention toward something deliberately unimportant or irrelevant in order to escape the grip of the thoughts that are actually keeping you awake. You might find yourself focusing intensely on the texture of your pillow, the precise pattern of shadows on your ceiling, the subtle sounds of your refrigerator humming in the distance, or the way your breath moves in and out of your body with mechanical precision. The key element here is that you are actively choosing to concentrate on something that holds no emotional charge, no stakes, and no consequences whatsoever. Psychological mechanism at work involves a fundamental principle of attention and cognitive load. Your conscious mind has a limited bandwidth, and it can only process a certain amount of information at any given moment. When you deliberately redirect your focus towards something neutral and undemanding, you are essentially consuming that bandwidth with low-priority information, leaving less capacity available for the intrusive, anxiety-laden thoughts that were previously dominating your mental space. This works because worry and racing thoughts require active engagement from your attention system. They need you to be mentally present with them in order to maintain their grip. By flooding that same attention system with benign sensory observations or trivial mental tasks, you create a kind of cognitive competition where the boring detail naturally wins because it requires less emotional energy to sustain. What makes this technique particularly resilient in human behavior is that we have normalized the idea that sleep should be effortless and automatic, yet we experience it as anything but, and so we have unconsciously developed these workarounds that feel natural and intuitive, even though they represent a somewhat paradoxical approach to the problem. We are essentially fighting fire with fire, addressing an overactive mind by giving it something to do, and across countless nights in countless bedrooms, this simple act of misdirection continues to serve as a bridge between wakefulness and sleep. Perhaps this is why the most effective misdirection is often the most mundane: counting ceiling tiles, mentally cataloging the contents of a familiar room, or reciting the alphabet backward, activities so devoid of meaning that they offer no foothold for anxiety to grab onto, yet structured enough to keep the mind from spiraling back into its preferred patterns of worry. In this way, deliberate misdirection reveals something essential about human consciousness: that we are not passive observers of our own minds, but active architects capable of redirecting the mental machinery when it threatens to overwhelm us, even if we do so in the quiet darkness where no one else will ever know. Have you ever noticed that when you lie in bed at night, unable to sleep, your mind begins to unconsciously synchronize your breathing pattern with external rhythms around you, perhaps the gentle hum of an air conditioning unit, the distant traffic sounds outside your window, or even the rhythmic ticking of a clock in the darkness, and as your breathing falls into step with these ambient patterns, something remarkable happens within your nervous system that begins to calm the constant mental chatter keeping you awake. This phenomenon of matching breathing rhythm is a subtle psychological mechanism that operates largely beneath conscious awareness, where your body instinctively seeks to align itself with predictable, repetitive patterns in the environment, and this synchronization has a profound effect on your nervous system's state of arousal and readiness. When your breathing becomes rhythmic and matched to an external pattern, your nervous system interprets this regularity as a signal of safety and predictability, which tells your brain that there are no immediate threats requiring vigilance or rapid response. And this interpretation causes your sympathetic nervous system to downregulate while your parasympathetic nervous system begins to take control, a shift that naturally facilitates the transition from wakefulness into sleep. The mechanism works because breathing is one of the few autonomic functions that bridges both conscious and unconscious control, meaning that by deliberately or accidentally matching your breathing to a steady external rhythm, you are essentially programming your body to adopt a calmer physiological state without requiring any active effort from your conscious mind. Yet despite the logical simplicity of this technique, we rarely acknowledge or deliberately employ it, instead treating it as a mysterious and somewhat magical occurrence that happens to us rather than something we can actively harness and utilize for our own benefit when sleep eludes us and we find ourselves lying awake in the darkness. By consciously identifying a steady rhythm in your environment, whether it's the distant sound of rainfall, a partner's gentle breathing beside you, or even a deliberately chosen ambient tone, You can transform this passive synchronization into an active tool, one that requires nothing more than your awareness and willingness to surrender your breath to the pattern, allowing your body to do what it naturally knows how to do. And when you find yourself struggling to locate such a rhythm naturally, you can create one deliberately, humming a low, steady tone, mentally counting breaths in a simple pattern like 4 counts in and 6 counts out, or even synchronizing with a partner's breathing if you're not alone, transforming the act of falling asleep from a frustrating battle of will into a gentle collaboration with your own physiology.